Surprise, Charlie, leaving my mic on just to get me in trouble. Hey.
Good morning, everyone. This subcommittee on mineral and energy resource come to order. I want to thank everyone from Morro Bay and all the people that have come to Morro Bay to hear about, as we conduct this hearing, to hear about the potential for offshore wind off the coast of California. I first want to thank Representative Carbajal, my dear friend, for welcoming us to his district. I'd also like to thank Representative Stauber, Representatives Panetta, Conway for making this trip to Paradise. And I'm going to now recognize Representative Carbajal to introduce elected officials that are here in the audience. No.
Fancy technology. Well, first of all, thank you, Chairman Lowenthal of the Energy and Minerals Resource Subcommittee, subcommittee of the Natural Resources Committee in Congress. Want to thank you for coming out for this hearing and all the staff that are making this possible. And welcome to everybody to Paradise. As you can see, we live in an extraordinary piece of this earth, and welcome everybody to come visit, spend a lot of money, and enjoy all the natural resources and wonderful people that live here. I wanted to thank also all the witnesses that we're going to get to in a while, many that will not be introduced until that time that they are providing testimony. So if you're not mentioned as the people that I'm going to recognize, don't fret. We're going to come back to you in a few. But in addition to thanking Chairman Lowenthal, I want to thank my colleagues who made the trek here for this very, very important hearing on offshore wind energy. I want to thank the mayor of the city of Morro Bay, Mayor John Heading, who is here gracing us with his presence. Councilmember Jeff Heller from the city of Morro Bay as well. Thank you for coming, and thank you for opening up your community center for this hearing. Appreciate the partnership, appreciate the collaboration, and with that, I will turn it back to our wonderful chairman, who only gave me limited time, so I want to respect that. Back to Chairman Lowenthal.
Thank you. You know, it's not often that we get to hold hearings this close to the beach, so I say this is quite a treat. But since this is an official congressional hearing, I have some parliamentary housekeeping before we begin to hear from our expert witnesses. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from the witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, Representative Carbajal and Panetta are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the hearing notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members present can provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. With that, I'm going to begin my opening statement. The Energy and Minerals Subcommittee today is meeting in Morro Bay to hear testimony on the future of offshore wind in California. With this with a great deal of interest now. This is my third time that I visited offshore wind. My first time was in June of 2019, where I took a site visit to Block Island Wind Farm, to the Wind Turbine Testing Center, because we're talking about very large turbines, and I wanted to see their development, and I wanted to see their development and their testing in America, not where they're being used other places. And I met with the scallop, especially in the Northeast, the scallop fishing people in New Bedford for a site visit and to see their and listen to their concerns. That was in June of 2019. In September of 2019, the Energy and Minerals Subcommittee held a hearing in Representative Van Drew's district on offshore wind. And again, much of the focus there too was on the fishing industry and how we could work on the multiple uses of the ocean and how we could develop cooperative relationships. And so this is my third kind of visit or trip, and I am very excited because what we're talking about is how our committee, which is charged with overseeing energy development in public lands and federal waters, how we can begin to look at how to manage and maintain on behalf of all Americans, and these are ideal locations frequently. People are very concerned in those locations because we're talking about some of the sunniest and windiest places in the country, if not the world. And while they're ideal locations for renewable energy development, there are other questions that are raised that must be answered before we move forward. And that's why we're here today, to discuss those issues and those questions. As we all know, renewable energy is key to fighting climate change, as California has experienced drought and tremendous heat. I come from Long Beach, usually also a coastal community. Last week it was 108 degrees in Long Beach, unheard of, 108 degrees. People, just didn't understand, how could that happen? So I think the timing of having this hearing now to develop this abundant renewable resource and to answer the questions about it and what makes for an appropriate site and what doesn't is critical and very, very timely at this moment. And we all know that if we can answer these questions, that offshore wind and federal provides an enormous opportunity to help our nation begin its shift towards a more clean energy economy and to be part of the overall package that the nation needs for its energy. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the offshore wind energy potential of the United States is nearly double the nation's current electricity use. While we don't yet have any commercial scale offshore wind projects off our coast yet that are operating, the Biden administration has been hard at work preparing for offshore wind's promising future. In March of 2021, the administration set a historic goal to deploy at least 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. Most of that will be off those sites that I mentioned and others in the Atlantic. By 2030, the goal is 3 to 5 gigawatts in California and 25 gigawatts off the Atlantic. But doing that will create nearly 80,000 good-paying jobs, power 10 million homes, support $12 billion in capital investments each year. And President Biden is making good on that promise to do that. To date, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, has held 10 competitive lease sales and has issued 25 active commercial leases. At one of the recent, I don't know if it was the last or the next to last, the lease sale, I guess it wasn't the last, it was one before that. The lease sale in February broke records, bringing in an impressive $4.375 billion. One lease sale brought in over just under $5 billion for 6 leases off the coast of New York and New Jersey. In May, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM again, held a lease sale off the coast of the Carolinas, well, not as large, also a very successful lease sale off the Carolinas coast. And in July announced plans to develop offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. Most importantly, we could be just weeks away from the first offshore wind lease sale in the Pacific. Questions to be answered, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we hold this hearing today, because there are questions that we need to answer before we move forward on that. The West Coast has always been promising for offshore wind development. There are large coastal population centers that need additional energy. We're seeing now, we're going through a period of, although we haven't had any, but the potential during this huge heat wave that's out here on the West Coast of potentially having rolling blackouts. Not that the sales that we're going to ultimately do will fix that right now, but obviously it just makes the timing of this and the issue of when you have large coastal population centers and supportive state laws, it allows for the opportunity for us to go forward. But as we prepare to unlock the enormous potential for offshore wind in the West, we must also address a unique set of challenges. First, it's taken significant collaboration between stakeholders to get us to the point that we are today, many of whom are out here in the audience or on our panel. So we need to understand what that collaborative process is like and what are some of the issues. For years now, communities have been working to address the specific challenges to offshore wind off the coast of California. For example, we have thriving commercial fisheries. We have the nation's largest international shipping lanes. There are issues that have to be dealt with in terms of that. The Pacific Outer Continental Shelf is significantly deeper than the Atlantic, and so it's going to require advancements than we already have in technology, in floating wind technology, which is different than the platforms that we're beginning to see developed in the Atlantic. And we also must address co-use of Pacific waters with the Department of Defense. You know, this is critical to the nation's defense and the world's defense, and so we're going to have to co-use those waters, and we have to work that out with them. We have the nation's largest ports, but they're not yet set up, or may not be the existing ones. We have to kind of come to an agreement and work that out to support the wind industry, how we're going to move, and provide the wind. We don't have all these answers right now, but we do have an opportunity to shape offshore wind development so it brings the most benefits to communities, protects the environment, and builds a strong union-led workforce. There'll be countless opportunities for jobs in the wind industry, the supply chain, and in the development of new or expanded port infrastructure. The Congress is going to work with the Department of Defense, with the shipping industry, and with our fishermen to address the concerns and the support of ocean users. That has to be done before we move forward. California is ready to play a major role in the development of offshore wind, especially in the development of floating platforms, and this Congress is ready and able to help make that future possible. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed by the Congress last year, makes upgrades to ports and electrical systems possible. The recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act includes tax incentives and funds for transmission planning that will be a boon for offshore wind development in California. I'm glad I personally supported these laws and look forward to seeing their benefits in the coming years. Again, thanks to everyone for joining us this morning, those of you that are here to testify, and everyone else that's participating in the future of offshore wind in California. I look forward to today's conversation, and I now recognize my good friend, Ranking Member Stauber, for his opening statement. Welcome to California.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal, and I appreciate your leadership on this committee. You have spent a number of years, and you are a class act. I know that you are going to be retiring, but I can tell you our friendship is going to go long past your retirement, and I want to thank you for your service. To Congressman Carbajal, I do have an issue with the term paradise. I'm from northern Minnesota, and we all think our districts are paradise, and I just really appreciate being here and actually holding these field hearings in our communities, in this beautiful community center. And to the mayor and councilor, thank you for offering this up to you. It is really a pleasure to be in sunny California this time of year. Back home in northern Minnesota, I live just outside Duluth. It's on the western tip of the greatest freshwater lake in the world, Lake Superior. We're starting to have our fall colors turn, and while our mornings are getting cooler and cooler. So this is like a brief extension of summer for me, and it's great to be with you all. I am a supporter of all of the above approach to energy. We do need a diverse, rich portfolio to ensure we can turn on the lights and access power to keep our community and economies moving. And offshore wind certainly will play a role in that portfolio as a topic with strong bipartisan appeal. I'm certain we can work together to ensure we have a robust offshore leasing program. However, offshore wind, like other emerging energy sources, is not magic. It will not solve the many issues we face in the energy sector on its own. Furthermore, as everyone on this subcommittee has heard me say many times, everything in this world is either farmed or mined, and offshore wind turbines are certainly not an exception. One wind turbine can require nearly 10,000 pounds of copper alone, along with massive amounts of steel, nickel, and more. This administration and some of my colleagues on this committee are moving to ban mining in my district in northern Minnesota, which is home to one of the richest sources of iron, copper, nickel, and cobalt in the world. It's called the Duluth Complex. It has 95% of this nation's nickel reserve, 88% of the cobalt reserve, and over a third of our copper, along with the other platinum metals. And the manufacturing of wind turbines accounts for massive amounts of power. 6 of the top 10 wind manufacturing plants are located in China, where they continue to build staggering wattages of coal-generated power. To reiterate, I support offshore wind as a supplement to our existing portfolio. I will, however, continue to make the point that wind power requires massive amounts of metals and power to create. Supply chain and life cycles analysis cannot be ignored in this process. Offshore wind projects are also subject to lengthy permitting delays, which is a major problem this majority has chosen to neglect. A relatively small offshore wind project off the coast of Rhode Island took the better part of a decade on its own. One of the mining projects in my district in Minnesota is pushing 20 years in its permitting process. Another one, 11 years in its permitting process. In the same watershed, the country of Canada opened up a gold mine 60 miles north in less than 3 years. And that does not even factor in transmission upgrades to deliver the power. I don't believe this administration is serious about delivering power in this country. They too often cater to certain groups and attorneys that profit on stopping responsible development. Meanwhile, this great state of California, mandated a 100% so-called renewable grid by 2045. Those mandates are creating huge problems as the state arbitrarily moves off of coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear. Just last week, Californians were asked to stop charging their electric vehicles during peak hours. And keep in mind, this was only days after the state moved to ban all gas cars by 2035. What are people supposed to do? They can't charge their EVs and they can't buy an internal combustion engine vehicle. And to make matters even worse, California's grid tapped all available power and issued a statewide grid emergency with rolling blackouts. I was told that in northern Minnesota, we need to take more scooters to work to help with our energy crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, when it's 40 below and my miners have to drive 35, 40, 50 miles to work and back, they are not taking scooters to or from work. With that being said, I really do appreciate the invitation from my good friend Chairman Lowenthal to discuss a new opportunity for power generation in the West. And I look forward to learning more today by listening to our witnesses from diverse backgrounds, including the Defense Department, labor, commercial fishing, and more. Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. Now we're going to begin with our first panel, and I'm going to introduce the witnesses. First, Mr. Doug Boren is the Pacific Regional Director for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and most of us know it by its name of BOEM. It's at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And then we have Mr. Ronald Tickle, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Real Property at the U.S. Department of Defense. And thank you both for being here today. We welcome you to the committee. And if I can change, okay, if I can open up the next page. Mr. Boren, you are now recognized for 5 minutes of testimony. I'm going to let all the witnesses, or both of the witnesses, testify first before we open up for questions by the panel. Mr. Boren, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, members of the subcommittee.
Excuse me, can you move the microphone closer to your mouth? Thank you. No.
And I'll start from the beginning.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM's, role in developing America's renewable energy resources on the Outer Continental Shelf, or OCS. My name is Doug Boren, and I'm the Regional Director of BOEM's Pacific Regional Office at the Department of the Interior. On May 25th of 2021, BOEM, the State of California, various California elected officials, and the Department of Defense, or DoD, announced a joint commitment to advance areas for offshore wind energy development offshore the northern and central coasts of California, enabling a path forward for the Humboldt Call area and the Morro Bay Call area. This agreement was the result of years of collaboration between the Departments of the Interior and Defense to find areas offshore California that are compatible with DoD's training and testing operations. The department acknowledged the critical nature of current and future military testing, training, and operations, and also acknowledged that ensuring the operational integrity thereof is a national security imperative. BOEM is committed to working with the Department of Defense to ensure long-term protection of military testing, training, and operations while pursuing clean energy development. On May 26, 2022, the Department of the Interior published the Proposed Sale Notice, or PSN, and announced the proposed auction details and lease terms for offshore wind energy development in the Morro Bay and Humboldt wind energy areas. The California PSN consists of approximately 583 square miles to unlock over 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind energy, which would power more than 1.5 million homes and create thousands of new jobs. This would also assist California in reaching its goal of up to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. BOEM works extensively and in coordination with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, to engage the commercial fishing industry through meetings and workshops throughout the offshore wind authorization process. We use the best available fishing data, science, and traditional knowledge to inform actions at every step of the process. And we will continue to work closely with various West Coast fishery sectors to continue our productive dialogue and meaningful engagement. Developing the infrastructure to support renewable energy offshore California is a challenge that requires significant onshore and offshore investments. Traditional fixed bottom offshore wind turbine foundations are not economically feasible in the deep waters of the Pacific. Floating wind turbines have potential, but floating turbine technology is newer and less deployed worldwide than fixed bottom foundations. Floating wind turbines can help harness offshore wind energy that was once thought unattainable in deep ocean waters here in the Pacific Ocean. BOEM continues to facilitate stakeholder engagement through the California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. The 5th meeting of this task force was held June 3rd, 2022. This was a valuable opportunity for stakeholders, ocean users, and members of the public to comment on the 5 proposed lease areas that could be available for leasing and on the proposed conditions and stipulations that will be incorporated into the final sale notice, which BOEM plans to publish later this year. In conclusion, BOEM is entrusted with a safe and responsible development of offshore energy resources for the nation. We are privileged and honored to fulfill that trust every day in every decision. We remain committed to active engagement with all stakeholders and partners to ensure the responsible development of these shared renewable energy resources on the OCS, and we will continue to keep the subcommittee informed of our progress. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you, Mr. Bourne. Mr. Tickle, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Got it. Okay. Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, members of the subcommittee. As mentioned, I am Ron Tickle, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Real Property. On behalf of the Department of Defense, I would like to thank the House Committee on Natural Resources for convening this hearing and for your efforts to consider the National Defense Mission and offshore energy siting decisions. As the committee knows, DoD has a significant presence within California. DoD recognizes that climate change poses an existential threat to national security. We have worked with the partners on this team for years and remain committed to finding a solution that protects military operations while supporting aggressive domestic renewable energy goals. DoD has been engaged with BOEM in discussions of wind energy development off the coast of California for almost a decade. BOEM's October 2018 Federal Register call for information and nomination notice reflected DoD's previous analysis for the 3 areas identified: the Diablo Canyon Call Area, the Morro Bay Call Area, and the Humboldt Area Call Area. The Diablo Canyon Call Area is heavily utilized by multiple DoD components, and based upon current and future expected uses, previous assessments have found the development there to be incompatible with a wide array of critical DoD activities. The Humboldt Call Area in the North Coast is currently designated as needing site-specific stipulations by the department, meaning that while DoD may request mitigation measures, offshore wind has been determined to be compatible with its missions. The notice also indicated that DoD was reviewing additional detailed project information supplied by the offshore wind industry to determine if any of the areas previously identified by DoD as incompatible in the Morro Bay Call Area may be identified as compatible after further analysis. Following BOEM's 2018 notice to pursue offshore wind in California, DoD worked collaboratively with our state, local, and federal partners, along with ocean users such as the commercial fishing industry, to explore opportunities to site offshore wind along the California Central Coast, specifically in the Morro Bay area. To support broad stakeholder interest, in August 2019, Representative Carbajal, in collaboration with Representative Panetta, assembled a multi-agency working group to explore the art of the possible for siting offshore wind along the California Central Coast. DoD greatly appreciated being invited to participate in this vital working group, to share and understand the diverse landscape of stakeholder issues to address the climate crisis while protecting user equities and DoD's vital national security objectives. Efforts by all parties led to the identification of an area in Morro Bay that is referred to as the Morro Bay 399 area. DoD supports BOEM's plans to lease within the area, provided certain mitigation measures are included in the lease sales, and DoD is assured long-term protection of testing, training, and operations elsewhere along the Central Coast. We were pleased with the Department of Interior's May 2021 statement calling the operational integrity of military testing and training in the Morro Bay a national security imperative, and DOI committed to work with DoD to ensure long-term protection of military operations while pursuing domestic clean energy resources. DoD remains committed to both goals. DoD conducts multiple missions in the vicinity of the Morro Bay 399 area. Maintaining capabilities in California is key to ensuring the highest readiness for our fighting forces. The advancements in warfighting capabilities designed to match peer adversaries require more testing and training space than ever before. Many of these activities support the U.S. Northern Command and the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Of key importance, carrier strike group training along the California Central Coast is required prior to deployment of a carrier strike group into the Pacific Theater. Other critical missions conducted in this area include the Navy utilizes the airspace daily for strike fighter wing and joint strike fighter wing training for aircraft out of NAS Lemoore, California. The Navy 3rd Fleet performs integrated carrier strike group training and certification. The Point Mugu Sea Range conducts unique research, test, and evaluation. The California Wind Development Proposal for the Morro Bay area is wholly located within military warning areas. Development may cause impacts on DoD activities that DoD itself cannot mitigate. However, DoD recognizes the national importance for renewable energy development and supports BOEM's plans to lease within the Morro Bay 399 area based on assurances of long-term protection of training, testing, and operations. We are committed to working with BOEM to develop solutions that support both missions, along with many other important interests represented in this room. Thank you for your commitment, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tickle. Before we go to questions, and now we're going to, there are 4 panels, I'd like to kind of remind both the witnesses and also the panelists to let's try to keep our questions succinct so you can get more answers out of folks, because there are a lot of issues that may, and also members of on the panel, you don't have to give long answers to our questions. I think everybody would, just give us the major points and we'll get back to you if there are any issues. And that will enable all of us to have a fuller discussion. I am not here to limit anything that you say. I'm just asking you to be as succinct as possible, as I'm asking us to be as succinct. So let me begin with Mr. Boren. As you mentioned, since 2016, BOEM has facilitated stakeholder engagements through the Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. Can you tell us more about those meetings and the conversations and how they have helped you to be where you are today, and if there have been any hurdles that have been very difficult to overcome? So we'd just like to know a little bit more about that.
Great. Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. And I'll say succinctness is probably one of my strong suits. We have been involved in partnership with the state of California, with the Intergovernmental Task Force. Some of the things that have come across the table, I'll just give a specific example of, we have made a lot of decisions with the task force in partnership with our federal partners in state. Back in 2018, when we had draft call areas, we took it to the task force and we ultimately eliminated some of the call areas. I think that was one decision point. Collaboration, is what we pride ourselves on the BOEM side. And I can say that, like Mr. Ron Tickle brought up earlier, some of the Central Coast call areas that we had in that 2018 call, they were first deemed incompatible, and it took us some time to get to the art of the possible, and we rolled up our sleeves and we were able to find solutions so that we can move forward to get to where we are today in the leasing process.
Mr. Boren, there's no doubt that the Inflation Reduction Act recently signed into law will be a benefit to the renewable energy industry. But there are also stipulations in the legislation which put limits on the actual wind leasing program. For example, BOEM cannot issue an offshore wind lease unless the Bureau has held an offshore oil and gas lease sale for at least 60 million acres. Question is, do you anticipate any delays to the California offshore wind lease sale because of this requirement? And do you have any concerns about BOEM's capacity to meet these requirements?
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. I do not anticipate any delays. We have committed at BOEM that we are going to have the California lease sale by the end of this year. We are still committed to do that in full compliance with the Inflation Reduction Act law. As far as capacity within, I just wanted to say that at BOEM, and in particular the Pacific region, has a great team, and we will work with what we have to accomplish the goals. I did want to say that in the past we have the BOEM team has received resources, compatible with the workload that's in front of us, and we're always looking at ways to, come up with ideas and some topics so that we can continue to receive the support and resources we need to move forward as the workload grows.
Thank you, Mr. Tickle. Can you tell us more about the history of DOD's involvement in the process of, as you mentioned, determining those areas that are appropriate for offshore wind, and maybe a little bit about the close cooperation between BOEM and the Department of Defense and why that's key for both agencies, because your role is critical in terms of determining what is appropriate and what is not.
Certainly. We work with BOEM before ever they issue a public call notice. They come to us and will ask us to assess an area, and it might be a very, very large area, the entire coast of California, for example. And we will go to every military department, joint staff, and seek their input on what they do in these areas. The first round is always sort of what do we do and how do we do it. As more and more details come available through where the good spots for the wind industry to develop, we can refine our assessment to come down to these are the specific impacts and determine if that is really an unacceptable impact or something we can try to mitigate. As I said in my testimony, we've worked California for over 10 years to get to this point, and a lot of our assessments have been very consistent. We haven't changed that much on the assessment process. It's been a great relationship. We think it's really valuable for us to work with BOEM and also even the wind industry so that they know the areas that are problematic for us. Try to be transparent. We don't want to see effort and time wasted on areas where we just know there's so much going on and there's long-term plans for an area that we don't see absolutely any way that we could change what we're doing or go to some other place. So the long-term relationship is good for us to get some assurance early up front, and I believe good for BOEM and for the industry to know which areas are problematic.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield back. I'm just try to hold that to just over 5 minutes, and now I'm going to recognize our ranking member for 5 minutes of questions. Ranking Member Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Boren, each state on the West Coast having its own rules about deploying transmission infrastructure creates a patchwork of laws and regulations. How does BOEM plan to reconcile this patchwork? And do you intend to take more of a top-down approach to ensure transmission gets deployed?
Thank you, Representative Stauber. I'll say that BOEM is responsible for making areas available on the OCS for renewable energy development. When it comes to the onshore transmission and where the transmission infrastructure is built, it really falls to the state side to figure that out. I can say that, the states along the West Coast are collaborating so that they can come to solutions for transmission capacity and making sure that the renewable energy that's on the OCS does get to the load center where it's needed.
So there is going to be a different approach depending on the state?
Correct. It's up to the state on how they figure out. And I'll give the example of the North Coast. We have capacity for approximately 1.6 gigawatts for the Humboldt proposed lease areas. The state of California is right now there is no transmission capacity for that, and they're going to have to figure that out.
Right. So what you're doing is you're appreciating states' rights.
That is correct.
There's recently been a 7,000 square mile Chumash National Heritage Marine Sanctuary proposed next to the wind energy areas. Federal land designations almost always cause difficulty in delivering the power, and in this case, laying desperately needed transmission lines. How is BOEM weighing the impacts to wind development during interagency discussions about the Chumash Sanctuary proposal?
Thank you, Congressman. We do collaborate with our federal partners at NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries Program. We're a cooperating agency on the NEPA document, so we are looking at, and we want to have an all-of-government approach to where we look at, conservation is very important to Department of the Interior, and at the same time, making sure that renewable energy can get to the grid where it's needed is important too. So we do collaborate, and we'll find solutions in an all-of-government approach.
Thank you. Mr. Tickle, thank you for being here as well. Interior and Defense have a long history of coordinating in the Gulf of Mexico to allow for oil and gas production. What coordination challenges are specific to wind production, and are there any Pacific Ocean unique challenges?
In the Gulf specifically, sir?
No, on the West Coast. Here.
The challenges are we are very heavily located in Southern California and Central California. And basically, as the Southern California is getting more and more congested, we have been moving more and more activities to the Central Coast. The coordination has not really been a problem. We've worked very, very closely together, and expect that to continue into the future.
Can you please share what Defense Department stipulations might be required in the wind energy areas available for in the upcoming lease sale?
Yes. We still have to negotiate those, obviously, but we have an idea. We have ones on the East Coast that will probably be looking at the same types of things, plus other ones on the West Coast. On the East Coast, there's typically a hold harmless clause where we are going to be conducting activities near those, and it is testing, things can go wrong, it is training, and some things don't always go right. So a hold harmless clause is typical. An evacuation clause, if, say, it's near a missile site, so to speak, so that we can get the workers out of there if they're on the location. We need to coordinate with them while they build these, because we'll be doing activities possibly in the area. We want to make sure that we understand where they are, when they are, so we can coordinate our activities with the fleet. In addition, we'll be seeking, I believe, curtailment hours, which is when we're doing certain activities that possibly our radars cannot accommodate, we'll be asking for the wind turbines to shut down. I think those are probably the major ones. Oh, one I want to specifically mention that you brought up briefly. We are very concerned about foreign investment, foreign involvement, who owns these wind farms, who runs these wind farms, who has access to these wind farms, because we will be operating in the vicinity of them.
When you say that, excuse me, when you say that, I've only got 25 seconds left. Are you talking about where the critical minerals are mined from? What are you talking about there?
About access to the wind farms by foreign entities that possibly have nefarious purposes in mind.
Okay, like what's potentially going to happen in North Dakota?
I've seen that, yes, sir.
Okay. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Mr. Carbajal for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Tickle, as a member of the House Armed Services Committee and federal representative for Morro Bay, this wonderful place, I know we've had an opportunity to connect many times before on balancing DOD's mission with meeting our renewable energy goals and ways developing offshore wind can help create new jobs in the region. I'm proud of the work we've accomplished so far to meet these mutual priorities. I know we have come a long way from 2018, when I first requested that briefing from the Navy, as you might recall. But I know we have more work ahead of us before this project gets across the finish line. Can you tell me what questions, in addition to what your previous response was to Representative Stauber, that remain unanswered that you would like to see resolved? I think you've touched on some of those, but there's a few other issues. If you could elaborate, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yes, sir. A key driver for obtaining the assurances for long-term protection that Doug and I both mentioned in our conversation from the department side was the unknown technical issues that are going to arise to our numerous weapon systems, radar systems, and sensors as these unique, probably never been built before wind turbines are built and come online. We constantly seek a better understanding of the technical analysis of what is going to be the impact from these wind turbines on our wider range of surface, subsurface, and aircraft that are going to be operating in the vicinity of the Morro Bay wind farm when it is up and running. For example, the Military Aviation and Installation Assurance Siting Clearinghouse was set up by Congress to evaluate energy proposals and assess the impact on the military operations. Recently, the Department of Navy raised a question about flight termination systems and what would be the impact of the wind farm on flight termination systems. A flight termination system is a system that is on most rockets and missiles. When something goes awry, you use that to end the flight, thereby protecting the range, people, military. And we've had no studies conducted to this point on what would there be an interference on that flight termination system for wind turbines. The clearinghouse just funded a $400,000 study to start assessing that. Those are the types of efforts that we're just going to have to systematically review as things become clearer and try to address and not only identify the impact, but also what possibly we can do to mitigate.
Thank you. I do appreciate the Navy's working in good faith to really resolve all these issues so we could come up with a win-win solution in this case. Mr. Bourne, from the proposed sale notice, we know that BOEM is considering some additional bidding credits and lease stipulations in the Pacific lease sale that it has not used in the Atlantic lease sale so far. Can you tell us anything about what will be included in the final sale notice? What led BOEM to consider these stipulations?
Thank you, Congressman Carbajal. In the proposed sale notice, we did have a specific community benefit agreement for lease use. And that specific agreement or community benefit agreement is targeting, use of the lease area itself, and for those that use the area and harvest resources from the area, which would be typically the commercial fishers or tribes. One of the things we asked about in the proposed sale notice was, a potential for another community benefit agreement, and we'll call it a general community benefit agreement. We got lots of comments on that. What BOEM has to do is balance, what we have the authority for and what we can require with our authority under the OCS Lands Act. So we are balancing that, and when we have the final answer in the final sale notice, then, you'll see what the answer is then. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bourne, I wanted to stress the importance of promoting project labor agreements with these projects, and I know BOEM has been receptive to those, so I really appreciate your commitment to making sure that is something that's considered. Mr. Bourne, can you tell us more about the environmental impact of floating wind turbine technology? What has BOEM learned about the difference between floating wind and fixed bottom turbines?
Thank you. I think the obvious answer is, fixed bottom is fixed to the bottom, and floating, you ultimately have some sort of cable and anchor system to hold it into place because the water is deeper. And this is something that it's not necessarily a new technology. It does come from, other offshore energy technologies. BOEM here in the Pacific, we've known this is coming. We've started research since essentially 2008, looking at, the potential impacts of floating offshore wind compared to fixed bottom offshore wind. So, we have a very robust studies program, so we are getting into the details. So when we get those first construction operation plans, we should have a good idea of what the potential impacts will be when we see what's actually proposed in the plan.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carbajal. I now recognize Ms. Conway for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Panetta, as the least ranking member of this committee. I jumped in ahead of you, Congressman. So I have some pretty simple questions. There's no questions that should go unanswered, even if they're simple. So really quickly, Mr. Bourne, if I understand this correctly, so we do the lease sell, and then we get started on a deep environmental review? Or do I have that backwards, or just quickly the process?
No, ma'am. So we do the NEPA review, but it's just for the lease sale and site issuance and site characterization activities. Because we don't have a plan in front of us, we don't know exactly what the impacts are going to be because we don't know the details. So we do it, like I said, an environmental review for the lease sale. Once we get the plan, then we do the deeper dive with the environmental impact statement and do the environmental review of the entire project.
Okay, so a lot of this cost is up front before we actually get to the product, I'm thinking. My second part of that question would just be, I know this is new and it's new technology, but it exists other places. Could you guesstimate what the time frame would be?
I guess, just so I'm clear, the time frame for what?
For from talking about it and doing all this. I think my question is, and actually I was going to ask Mr. Tickle this question, but now it's out there. Will I see this in my lifetime?
Yeah,
I would tell you my age, but I think it's written all over my face. So,
I will say that the goal is to, once we have the lease sale later this year, is to have these projects in the water by 2030. So that's kind of a good time frame. What we learned from the Atlantic coast is, once you have the lease sale, it does take some time for the lessee to develop a construction operation plan, submit that to BOEM, and then for BOEM to do the environmental work to make the decision on that plan, and then, construction. So it's, it could be 5 to 7 years, but I think that's within the, constructed and deployed by the 2030 timeframe.
well, that's quick. I'm hoping that my lifetime is at least 5 to 7 years more. So thank you for that. And I think the question, quick question for Mr. Tickle. You mentioned about challenges with DOD and all that's going on. Do they seem insurmountable? I mean, I'm just here gathering information, and I'm thinking, how do we coordinate all of this without total disruption of systems that we already have? And in the end, is whatever's produced worthwhile if you look at the cost, not only monetarily but environmentally? That this will be an environmental cost. So, thoughts on that?
Yes, ma'am.
And I won't hold you to this.
No,
just your
that's
thoughts.
fine. We have been in the wind energy business onshore now for 10 years through the clearinghouse. So a lot of these systems are not solely used offshore, they're used onshore. But it's those unique things that we haven't thought about that we're focusing on for the offshore technical assessments and technical questions. I think we'll get a handle on it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'm familiar with the wind projects in Kern County, which is my neck of the woods, but also in the foothills on the way to the north coast. Many of those wind turbines down because of bird strikes and a lot of stuff going on. So I appreciate that. And the last thing, I just have to say this. I'm envisioning these floating but maybe anchored wind turbines, and my mind is simple, and it just keeps little song, Weebles Wobble, but they don't fall down, keeps popping in my mind. I mean, is there a chance that these things are going to, after all the investment and all the work and all the hope that some have for this being environmentally great power production, I don't know. You don't have to answer. It's just the ramblings of my mind. It's like, how is this all going to work? So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, thank you, Ms. Conway. I now call on Mr. Panetta for 5 minutes of questions.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity to be here today to listen and learn and have a discussion about such an important topic to this area, to the state of California, and ultimately to the United States of America. But first of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this committee for this hearing, and also thank you for your stalwart leadership. Not just as a California Congress member, but as a Congress member for the United States of America, and what you have done and what your legacy will continue to do when it comes to the environmental protections that you have left us and motivate us to continue to stand firm when it comes to protecting that's something that's so important here on the West Coast. So thank you very much. And of course, thanks to my colleague and good friend, Representative Carbajal, for having me down on the Central Coast, in the southern part of the Central Coast. Always good to be here and to be in your district. So thank you very much. And thank you for your outstanding leadership on the Offshore Wind Development Working Group as well. I truly appreciate being a part of that as well. And thanks to my colleagues Stauber and Conway for making the trek out to the coast here. So appreciate being with you. This is about balance. That's what we do here on the Central Coast of California. We balance. We balance between our beauty and between our bounty. And we have a lot of both here, clearly, as we see. It's not easy, but that's our job, and that's what everybody must do. We are not binary. We balance. Let's make that clear. And what that balance means is that everybody must have a seat at the table. Every voice must be heard and must be listened to, and we must continue to collaborate and coordinate accordingly. Now, I think we've seen that in the early stages of this project with the leadership of Representative Carbajal and that Offshore Wind Working Group, and that basically people have been at the table and people have continued to have the types of discussions that are necessary to fully vet this type of impactful project, an impactful project, like I said, on both our beauty and our bounty that we have here on the Central Coast. And discussing, obviously, not only the impacts, but the benefits of offshore wind, which I think is made clear based on some of the discussions that we've had. But we also got to make sure that, like I said, the beauty and the bounty and the economy from those areas aren't impacted significantly by having this type of development off the Central Coast of California. So it's an honor to be here to listen and to learn from all of our stakeholders, which I believe firmly, based on where I come from, which is the Central Coast of California, that it's absolutely essential that we have this type of hearing. But it cannot stop here. We cannot just talk today. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow. And so I look forward to being a part of this process, especially on such an impactful project on the beauty and bounty that we value so much here on the Central Coast. Mr. Boren, in regards to that, a lot of people have a lot to say about this, and they will continue to, especially when it comes to public comment and the public comment process. Can you explain to us and the people behind you what exactly BOEM does in taking into account these public comments?
Great, thank you, Congressman Panetta. And I would say we heartily agree in the balance. The public comments, and I'll give the proposed sale notice as an example. So we did have a 60-day public comment period on that, and I just wanted to say that those comments, are on regulations.gov and they're available publicly. The process is that BOEM looks at all of the comments as we make decisions in the final sale notice. It takes a lot of work because we got a lot of comments, and there were a lot of great comments that are in there, and definitely something to weigh. And one of the things that we do at BOEM is we provide that feedback loop. So not only will we take the comments into consideration as we develop that final sale notice, we'll publish a response to comments at the same time, so it will show everyone here in the room and others exactly how we took their comments into consideration as we move forward with that final sale notice.
Great. And with the 39 seconds I have left, is there precedence for this type of project around the world? This big, these types of floating transmission, not only transmission lines, but the turbines themselves?
At this current time, there is no precedent. I think the largest floating turbine is just coming online here soon off the coast of Norway, the Hywind Tampen project. And I believe that is 11 8 or 8.5 megawatt turbines, and that's the largest to date.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. I want to that brings to a close the questions from the panel to the witnesses in our first panel itself. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and for the members for this round of questions. Everybody kind of stayed, was succinct, and I like that. And this concludes our first panel. To all our witnesses, members may have additional questions for you, and we ask for you to respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit written questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for those responses from members of the panel. Thank you again. You're free to go if you wish, but you're also welcome to stay and listen to the rest of the hearing. Now let's take a moment and transition to the second panel. Thank you. It was. First is Ms. Courtney Vaccaro, who is the lead commissioner for offshore wind at the California Energy Commission. I'm now going to yield to Representative Carbajal to introduce the witnesses from his district.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, for convening this hearing again and wanting to hear from our local partners on how offshore wind can be a win-win for our local economies and help meet our renewable energy goals, not only locally, but statewide. I want to thank and extend a special welcome to Supervisor Ortiz-Legg, who has been involved in offshore wind discussions early on. Supervisor Arnold is here as well. She'll be speaking in a while at another panel. I also want to extend my gratitude to Assemblymember Cunningham and Chairwoman Sage Walker for making the time to be part of this important hearing to discuss the state's and tribal involvement in these negotiations to bring offshore wind to the area. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time, all the panelists for taking time to be with us today. Ms. Vaccaro, let's begin. You have 5 minutes that you'll be recognized for.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and committee members. It's my honor to appear before you today. My name is Courtney Vaccaro, and I'm a commissioner with the California Energy Commission. The Energy Commission is the state's leading energy policy and planning agency, and it works with partner agencies to ensure that the state's energy system remains reliable, safe, and affordable. I'd like to begin by thanking you for holding this hearing in a local California community at the center of floating offshore wind energy planning and development. We recognize the potential of offshore wind development to provide benefits to communities such as Morro Bay. California is currently taking bold action to address the urgency of the climate crisis and the resulting impacts, which are occurring sooner and with greater intensity and frequency than anticipated and causing unprecedented stress on the state's energy system, as we've seen this past week. The state's focus on strategies to strengthen climate change resilience, advance zero carbon and renewable energy technologies and policies, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide includes swiftly, yet thoughtfully and responsibly expanding the state's renewable resource portfolio to include offshore wind energy. In July 2022, Governor Newsom issued a letter to state leaders calling for urgent action to work with our federal partners to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind to help the state meet its clean energy goals. Just 1 year earlier, Governor Newsom signed into law Assembly Bill 525, which calls on the California Energy Commission by June of 2023 to establish a strategic plan for offshore wind energy development in federal waters offshore California. In August 2022, to inform that strategic plan, the California Energy Commission established offshore wind planning goals for federal waters offshore California. 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. The Energy Commission is currently working towards identifying suitable sea space to accommodate these planning goals. And this analytical work will consider existing data and information on offshore wind resource potential and commercial availability, existing and new transmission and port infrastructure, and protection of ocean, coastal, cultural, and biological resources. And it will require close coordination and continued partnership with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. As we sit here today, our partner BOEM is poised to hold its first ever California offshore wind lease sale. California, through a comment letter jointly submitted by 9 state agencies, including the California Energy Commission, on the proposed sale notice for the Pacific Wind lease sale, recognized the significance of this moment and also offered to BOEM some insights and recommendations in its development of the final sale notice. This included a recommendation for BOEM to offer the opportunity for a 50% bidding credit that would be comprised of 20% for supply chain, 5% to prepare a diverse, skilled, and trained workforce in California to deploy floating offshore wind, 10% for community benefits for lease area users, 10% for community benefits agreements with onshore communities, and 5% for environmental monitoring and adaptive management. This recommendation reflects our perspective that the magnitude of investment required to establish a new industry in a way that minimizes impacts, maximizes benefits, and results in renewable energy generation that is affordable to California ratepayers, but also results in a fair return to the United States. As California eagerly awaits the release of the final sale notice and lease, it will continue to invest in research and development and take important and timely action for wind energy development offshore California. As we sit here, California currently has $14 million in solicitations available for grant opportunities for advancements in floating offshore wind technology. At the same time, energy and transmission planning are ongoing with an eye towards future requirements for both procurement and the development of transmission that's needed in California to integrate offshore wind energy at the scale and in recognition of the unique differences of the transmission systems connecting the central and north coast regions to the rest of the state. The state has made and will continue to make investments to assess opportunities for California's ports and waterfront facilities, and likewise, we will continue to invest in environmental studies. California and the federal government are at an opportune time to leverage our collective efforts to lay out a vision and a new level of partnership for offshore wind. At the same time, California will continue working with stakeholders of all kinds to advance common interests and shared values of economic prosperity, environmental stewardship, and energy resilience. I thank you for your time and opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Vaccaro. I now recognize Ms. Ortiz-Legg. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, members of the California Delegation Subcommittee, including my own Congressman Carvajal. My name is Dawn Ortiz-Legg, and welcome to San Luis Obispo County. It is a great pleasure and honor to be invited to provide testimony to the House Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources regarding offshore wind and evolving industry. The County of San Luis Obispo recognizes our unique position adjacent to one of only 2 wind areas of the West Coast. wind energy areas on the West Coast. We regard offshore wind as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to stimulate widespread economic growth by fostering a new industry. We recognize the innovative leadership of the Biden-Harris administration in creating a new industry requires collaboration and expertise, and we welcome all to this effort. The county has a long history of producing energy, including oil and gas extraction, natural gas, nuclear, and solar power generation. Originally constructed for commercial shipping of goods and passengers, Port San Luis Pier was the largest crude oil shipping port in the world in the 1910s. Since the 1980s, the county has hosted 2.2 gigawatts of carbon-free baseload energy generation at Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant, which represents nearly 10% of the state's energy portfolio. The county also hosts 800 megawatts of utility-scale solar generation. The two solar plants were early adopters, demonstrating the balance that can be achieved between clean energy generation and the protection of species, plants, and cultural resources. As we look to offshore wind development, we are committed to continuing our legacy as one of California's vital power-generating counties. The county recognizes development of a new clean energy industry as our coastline has the potential to be transformational. So united on this front, our County Board of Supervisors passed a resolution in June 2021 proclaiming our support for federal and state initiatives aimed at developing offshore wind, energy storage, and other forms of renewable energy. We are highly engaged in offshore wind discussions. My colleague Supervisor Bruce Gibson and I both sit on BOEM's California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. We regularly collaborate with federal, state, regional, and private sector offshore wind stakeholders. Last month, the county submitted written public comment on BOEM's draft proposed sale notice for the upcoming offshore wind lease auction. The potential economic benefits of offshore wind for our Central Coast region are significant. A study conducted in April 2021 by our economic development organization, REACH, and our local Cal Poly State University determined that the key to realizing economic benefits is constructing and operating a specialized wind port within our county's jurisdiction. The study estimated that constructing an operations and maintenance port for 3-gigawatt wind farm would generate nearly 12,000 jobs, and operating that port in perpetuity would create over 600 permanent, full-time, good-paying jobs. In addition to head-of-household job creation, our region has the potential to realize hundreds of millions of dollars in economic output from offshore wind. We've heard from federal and industry stakeholders that proximity to the port matters. It matters from an economic perspective for developers, and it matters for the affected communities adjacent to the development. With this opportunity in mind, we are making financial investments now in determining how we can prepare for and harness the benefits of offshore wind. With support from our county, Santa Barbara County, and the City of Morro Bay, REACH will be completing a study this fall that will assess waterfront infrastructure opportunities, options including siting and redevelopment possibilities pertaining to the development, construction, and future maintenance to support offshore wind. The county's commitment will help the state and federal governments achieve their ambitious goals. As BOEM currently reviewing comments on their bidding process, I would like to offer my perspective based on the decade of private experience on renewable energy, developing, constructing 2 gigawatts of utility-scale solar generation. And the ability to successfully execute the fledgling wind industry on the West Coast will require as much de-risking as possible in the areas where control exists to do so. Specifically, it is important to provide the bidding credits that value the Biden administration's federal offshore wind partnership, which seeks to expand key elements of supply chain, including manufacturing facilities for offshore wind, port capabilities, logistical networks needed to install projects, and workforce development, and to utilize the lease auction process to support these goals. We also want to support the offshore wind industry as developers to provide them with that certainty that is so critical in development. In addition, we want to make sure that community benefits agreements can be addressed to those communities that often feel left out and ensure the affected communities are engaged early and often through the offshore wind development process. It is my experience that project labor agreements have resulted in strong support and can increase project viability, and while the Bureau cannot force PLAs, they can increase credits to incentivize. Lastly, the solar boom happened with the requirement of procurement from all energy procurement folks. And that means that not just the investor-owned utilities, but also the community choice aggregators need to ensure this investment occurs. With the winning combination of ample existing transmission infrastructure, both at Diablo Canyon and Morro Bay, a highly skilled workforce, our region is eager and united in its support for responsible offshore wind development. We appreciate the interests of the Natural Resources Committee in this development in California, and we look forward to working with the federal, state, industry, and local agencies and other partners on this opportunity. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Now we recognize Ms. Sage Walker. You are recognized for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee.
Chair Lowenthal and Ranking Member Stolber and Representative Carbajal Panetta, good to see you, and Ms. Conway, thank you for coming here to Morro Bay. My name is Violet Sage Walker. I am the chairwoman of the Northern Chumash Tribal Council and the nominator of the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. I appreciate you all traveling to our homeland here in Morro Bay. What weighs heavy on my mind is this inherited obligation Indigenous people have to protect our homelands. As climate change intensifies, our future as coastal maritime people becomes more complex and uncertain. We always need the assurance that not only will we advance our marine protection and the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary designation, but also that wind farm energy, wind farm leases will partner and support the national marine sanctuaries, the Indigenous people, and not attempt to prevent, undermine, or dissolve them. This assurance is not just for the tribes, but also for the communities that have been seeking lasting protection for the coastline, our viewshed, which is our major reason why people choose to live here. The Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary will combat pollution as well as enhance water quality, tourism, the economy, commercial, and recreational fisheries. The health of our ocean is inherently tied to the health of our communities. Indigenous people have been the environmental stewards since time immemorial. Today, tribal communities around the world are addressing massive climate problems dealing with water quality, fires, fishery, land management, and providing healthy, thriving places for all people to live. The great irony of the situation is that we have been fighting problems that we did not create, nor did we support in the first place. The Northern Chumash Tribal Council is known for showing up and putting in hard work to make sure development is smart and considers the impacts not just for today, but for the next 7 generations. We must preserve what makes our homeland spectacular. That is our beaches, our ocean, and our viewshed. We want offshore wind energy to succeed, and we must go forward together in a good way. By avoiding the mistakes of the past, offshore wind energy should not be in the same category as offshore oil drilling. Offshore wind must be framed differently. We need a new model that doesn't talk about competing interests or excluding conservation or marine sanctuaries or tribal people or marginalized communities. The advancement of offshore wind needs to be a collaborative process, not a combative one. We need to ensure our wind farm leaseholders are people we want our grandchildren to be partners with. Ocean conservation is equally as important as renewable energy and must be advanced simultaneously, as with the same commitment. This commitment means designating the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. It also means greater support for ocean conservation efforts from the federal, state, and offshore wind companies. We need to be all in for both things. We need commitments from wind farms and leaseholders that they will also support these conservation efforts, including the designation of sanctuaries and the reassurances that they will not attempt to prevent, undermine, or otherwise hinder any of them. This assurance is for the tribes and for the communities who have fought so many years for the lasting protection of our beautiful coastline. When it comes to subsidies, economic benefits, and new jobs, let's include the marine sciences, ecology, supporting healthy oceans. We need to invest in marine mammal rescue, bird rescue centers, wildlife care facilities, aquaculture, fisheries, and water sampling facilities. Leases should ensure that animals and plants get a share of the subsidies and that environmental organizations who protect them are not unduly burdened by the inevitable impacts of constructing large offshore wind farms. We must use this opportunity to correct the legacies of inequity. Merely hiring tribal liaisons or putting tribes on a volunteer advisory council does not provide true collaboration. We need to do better and have concrete language to facilitate meaningful relationships between leaseholders, the tribes, and the land. Notably, there is no language in the offshore wind leases that addresses one of the most significant tribal priorities, the impacts of onshore landing infrastructure being placed on our sacred sites, our ceremonies, our village sites, and our ancestral land. These lands should be preserved and returned to the tribes for restoration and participation in the blue economy. We should not be made to wait another 3 generations to reclaim our sites in Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon. Let's negotiate now that the land be restored and returned to the tribes and not leave our status uncertain for a minute longer. Please consider the impacts that these leases will have for the next 40 years. Ensure that communities along the Central Coast, like the ports of Long Beach and other communities, don't grow to regret this. How do we ensure collaborative partnership with wind farm leases today and in the future? We will all likely be walking with the ancestors before we see these wind farm leases up. And I ask myself, what legacy will we leave for my nephew, for our relatives to clean up? Let me be clear, the Northern Chumash Tribal Council supports wind energy. We have been working with BOEM, federal and state agencies for years now. Our primary concern is that wind farms are sited carefully with environmental consideration and consultation with tribes, communities, and scientific experts together. We support the designation of the Morro Bay wind energy 20 miles off of our shore to minimize the conflicts with environmental and cultural values. We have been trying to protect our homeland since time immemorial, and we ask today that our heritage, our input, and our traditional knowledge be valued, that offshore wind leases be used to repair cultural and environmental damage of the last 2 decades.
Can you try to come to a conclusion soon? You're a little bit over time.
Sure. That is my conclusion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Sage Walker, I wish everybody would follow my directions. Now, Mr. Cunningham, you are recognized for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. And I want to thank Mr. Carbajal for his steadfast leadership and partnership as both the federal level and state level and local level of government have moved through this process over the last 5-6 years. I've been representing, it's been my great privilege and honor to represent the 35th State Assembly District, which is comprised of San Luis Obispo County and northern Santa Barbara County for the past 6 years. I've also served on the Assembly Utilities and Energy Committee during that time period. And I've had the privilege of being involved in and authoring a number of bills. And I want to focus my statement on what we've done at the state level in the legislature to promote offshore wind power and ensure a reliable electricity grid and reduce our carbon emissions over time. As was mentioned, AB 525 put into law a bill I jointly authored on a bipartisan basis for the first time in California history, a requirement that the California Energy Commission study and set targets and goals for the eventual procurement of offshore wind power in California, up to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and up to 25 gigawatts by 2045. Now, we have a long path to get there, but that statute, putting that into law, solidified the state's commitment to developing, in conjunction with our federal partners, the potential for offshore wind power off the coast. In terms of grid reliability, I was able to, again, jointly author the bill to extend the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant until 2030. The governor recently signed that into law last week. It's not a sure thing yet, but that at least provides a transition plan, if you will, a period of time from the 2026 to 2030 timeframe where we can have over 2 gigawatts of baseload power from Diablo Canyon put into our grid with zero carbon emissions and get us to that 2030 date where we're all hoping offshore wind procurement and development will really start adding electricity to our grid. Our state faces a number of challenges. We've seen in this recent heat wave, which has been a quite bad one. We've seen rolling blackouts, we've seen flex alerts, we've seen all of these various things. I think that's going to be a fixture, actually, and part of our life in California for the foreseeable future, which imparts that additional sense of urgency to do what we need to do to make sure we can get offshore wind working for Californians and use that to shore up our grid reliability. An additional state level thing, there's money in the budget for a port feasibility study this year off the Diablo Canyon, Morro Bay area generally. I think that's important because we can look into whether that makes sense as we expand our port capacity. We all know our ports in California are large, and they ship a lot of goods, and they're also very burdened. So it's imperative on us to look into other options, or at least study and see whether that's something that might make sense for the future of the state and the country. And there's also money for offshore wind infrastructure in the state budget this year, which is great to see. And again, that further cements our commitment as a state to move in the direction of offshore wind energy. One thing I hope we get into today at some point is the need for us to, in addition to developing out offshore wind, look at different forms of storage, high-capacity storage, whether it be battery storage, pump storage, gravitational storage. California, as you all probably know, is a major power exporter during the sunlight hours. We overproduce solar, produce more than we need, and export it, but when it gets dark and solar drops to zero, we become heavily reliant as a state on natural gas produced electricity and heavily reliant on out-of-state imports. And if we were able to build out the storage capacity, be it battery storage or whatever, in conjunction with offshore wind and other forms of renewable energy, we could achieve the goal we set for ourselves of having a completely renewable energy grid that functions, by the year 2045. But I think storage is maybe sometimes an overlooked but essential piece or component, if you will, of getting to that future. With that, I yield back my time, I think is the phrase, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. I want to remind the members of the committee that we have a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair is going to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask this panel. And I'm going to start with myself and Ms. Courtney Vaccaro. I'm going to follow up on what Mr. Cunningham, what I perceived was that sense of urgency that he was talking about, what the state needs to do. Ms. Vaccaro, as you've mentioned, the California Energy Commission set a goal to deploy up to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and up to 25 by 2045. But I want to talk about how the recent electricity reliability challenges in the state make meeting these goals and even potentially surpassing them even more pressing. Do you feel, are we going to be able to meet these goals? And do you see offshore wind fitting into California's current and future energy mix? And maybe describe that a little bit more too.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think I'll start with, I'm incredibly hopeful and optimistic that we are going to meet those goals. One thing that we did make clear in the report setting those goals is that they are big and they are bold and they are aspirational in some respects, because as we've already heard, there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that we can get commercial scale floating offshore wind in California. It's a nascent technology. We've already heard this morning. We're still in a pre-commercial stage. And those goals are really essential, especially the 2045 goal, to incentivizing investment in this marketplace. We need to stand up this new industry, and we also need to ensure that it is durable and long-lasting. It's an important aspect as we see it as a resource and a technology for California's renewable energy portfolio. We're looking at, as has already been mentioned, meeting 100% of retail electricity sales in California to customers with eligible renewable energy resources and zero carbon resources. In order to meet that goal, to meet the climate crisis, to meet what we believe is going to be continuing climate change impacts, where we will be seeing effects just as we've been experiencing this week, extreme heat event that has incredibly stressed the California grid. We need resources like offshore wind to allow us, as Mr. Cunningham said, to complement and supplement resources such as solar, that at the end of the day, that's when they ramp down, but that's when we can look to offshore wind to be a stable resource for California ratepayers. And we're also really seeing those goals as a means to affordability for California ratepayers as well.
Thank you. Ms. Ortiz-Legg, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what San Luis Obispo County is doing to prepare for the arrival of offshore wind jobs. what you're doing about job development.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chairman. So I think that one of the things that's really important is, as I had mentioned, is our history in energy generation and production here. So we're used to transitioning from one industry to another. So in that vein, we're just preparing in regards to our institutions, Cal Poly and Cuesta College, and talking to them about their educational goals, as well as early as grade schoolers right now. So our San Luis Coastal School District actually has a curriculum designed towards offshore wind. So all of these things are generational. We have the existing knowledge base that's there at Diablo Canyon and our solar generators, and then we have things coming up for the future. The second thing, of course, is that we need to understand where we're going to have any kind of infrastructure. And once we understand where that possibly could be, then we'll be able to determine what kind of jobs we will be creating. So I think that pretty much takes a good shape. You know, we work very closely with labor and with industry both to really have them give us input on what they need. And so we're all ears.
Thank you. My final question is from Ms. Violet Sage Walker. From your perspective, has BOEM adequately considered the impacts of offshore wind development on the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary?
Thank you. That's an important question, something that we think about all the time, and I think that we can circle back around to the idea that both need to be compatible and simultaneously planned together, and not one without the other. So I think that part of smart and wise planning is to expect them both and to plan for them both. So as long as we have that in mind, I think we'll be okay.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield back, and now I recognize Representative Stauber for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Supervisor Ortiz-Lag, I want to first off thank you for bringing the comment about the workforce and the labor force. You struck a great nerve with me. That's exactly what I'm trying to do in northeastern Minnesota. For those in the audience who don't know this, the Iron Range of Minnesota mines the iron ore that makes 80+% of this nation's steel that's going to go in these offshore windmills. And it's all union labor. When we talk about critical minerals, I talked about the Duluth Complex on critical minerals. There's project labor agreements in place. 2 of those mines will give us $1 billion of economic activity every single year. And this administration is banning mining in northeastern Minnesota. The critical minerals that are going to go in these offshore windmills. And it's very frustrating because on panel 5, we're going to have an IBEW member here. We're going to talk about project labor agreements, how important they are. So in California, you have IBEW supporters for project labor agreements and other labor unions. That's exactly what we're doing in northeastern Minnesota, and this administration is pulling the leases. That is frustrating, so thank you for bringing up the labor point. Very, very important, which would be an economic boom for our area. Mr. Cunningham, thank you for joining us today. The nearby Diablo Canyon nuclear facility's life has been extended by the California State Legislature, just before the state issued a power grid emergency alert on Labor Day to avoid blackouts. How much power does California receive from Diablo Canyon?
So Diablo Canyon is roughly 9% on average of the state's energy. It's the single largest carbon-free producing asset. And in terms of numbers of megawatt hours, it's about 2,200 megawatts a day, which is baseload power, so meaning 24/7, rain or shine, day or night.
And so nuclear's baseload power is reliable and environmentally friendly. Can you discuss reliability concerns in California in recent years and how nuclear energy helps to mitigate those concerns?
Well, when you have over 2 gigawatts of baseload power and you're in a grid situation where you have to go procure power to keep the lights on and air conditioning units running and so forth, having the baseload power means you don't have to buy that amount of energy, which is largely imported in California at nighttime from out of state, predominantly natural gas producing assets. So it's very helpful and it's very critical, and I think that's part of the reason that the governor ended up supporting and pushing for the 5-year extension of Diablo Canyon, and that we were able to get a resounding bipartisan coalition of support behind the bill to do that.
What are the consequences for the ratepayers of California as they subsidize a mandated shift to a fully renewable grid by 2045?
I think it depends on how it's done. I think if it's always the case that if you're short in the megawatt hours you need and you have to go buy it on the spot market, that's very expensive. A megawatt was selling the other day during the heat wave for over $700. That's quite expensive. The cost, for comparison purposes, the average cost to produce a megawatt hour at Diablo is about $62. So I think it protects ratepayers in that respect, and I think as we sort of transition and look to, it could align very perfectly with 5 more years of Diablo, could be when we get offshore sited and actually the turbines spinning and putting electricity into the grid right around the same time, and we have transmission infrastructure available there to do that. So unlike the North State and Humboldt, we don't have to go build that out. That's already an asset. So I think the effect on ratepayers ultimately, it's always going to be negative if the state can't produce enough of its own power, because they have to go buy the out-of-state power, and those costs are passed along to ratepayers. So the more we can do to make sure we've got a robust grid and all of the above approach, if you will, in terms of power generation for California, the more we're going to protect the ratepayers.
I think that what you said is the all of the above energy strategy important. Last question, Mr. Chair, real quick. Is there anybody on the panel that disagrees with this statement? We would rather get our critical minerals mined here in the United States by union labor and the best environmental standards. Is there anybody that disagrees with that? I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. I now recognize Mr. Carbajal, our host, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Ortiz-Legg, as you know, I convene an offshore wind energy group to bring key stakeholders together to make sure we are advancing our mutual goals of wind energy and not impacting our national security. As we move closer to developing offshore wind off of Morro Bay, do you see the need of also creating an advisory group to bring in all local partners and continue to ensure that they are part of that process to the very end?
I think it's really critical, Congressman. You know, in the development of any kind of new industry, as well as large projects like this, the more communication amongst our stakeholders, the better. There is so many moving parts in the energy business that it's really important for us to be all on the same page as much as possible to be able to really fulfill the needs, the desires, and the critical output that what we have here in this goal, which is to generate some carbon-free energy. And so I think that would be very much welcomed.
Thank you. Ms. Sage Walker, building on Chairman Lowenthal's question, can you speak to your partnership, what your partnership has been between the federal, state, and local partners in balancing, advancing offshore wind and the creation of the Chumash National Marine Sanctuary? Has it been working well? Can it be better? You kind of already touched on this, but anything you could add would be helpful.
Thank you for the question. I think you better than anybody know how much work we've put into this partnership and determination to see the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary go forward. And that being said, it's been my commitment to also problem solve all these other things that have come up in the time in the last 7 years since the nomination, and that includes boundaries. It includes working with offshore wind. It includes correct siting with the Department of Defense and Homeland Security and different issues. It includes the crossing of cables, including what Ranking Member Stauber had mentioned earlier, that cables do cross marine sanctuaries. They're environmentally sited correctly. That's a really important thing. We have about 3 dozen fiber optic cables that will cross over the wind farm leases area, and the cables will cross over these existing power cables. So all these things I've become an expert on, and involuntarily expert. And so thank you for asking the question. It's been almost 10 years of my life learning about stuff that I never thought I would have to address. So
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham, thank you for all the work that you've done at the state to promote offshore wind. If Diablo remains operational until 2030, how do you see the state applying the same effort in accelerating the development of future offshore wind and renewable energy? You briefly have touched on some of the funding and some of the things. If you could reiterate and maybe expand on that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I think first we've got money in the budget to do some infrastructure-related work. I think the state still needs to develop a procurement process for offshore wind power to sort of build out the market structure there. That's something, since we'd never done offshore wind before off the West Coast, that's something new. We have those structures in place for terrestrial wind development. I think there's a model there that the state can use. I think that's another important component. Lastly, I think we couldn't be more committed to offshore wind. We've set a goal 25 gigawatts by 2045. That's a pretty lofty goal, but I think there's going to be issues that arise. One thing the Diablo Canyon Extension Bill did is it provided for some streamlined permitting and things of that sort because it had to be done quickly, and without that, the extension of the nuclear plant wasn't going to work. I think that same approach could be used for generating renewable energy assets. If we're going to say, hey, this is an emergency, we need reliable grid, we need to decarbonize, we need to meet our goals, then we treat it as an emergency and we give some streamlining for projects, whether it be storage or offshore wind or any other type of renewable, because it's no secret, but the permitting process in California, especially if you're in the coastal zone, is a very lengthy, very expensive, very litigious process. So I think that's another area the state could step in and get us further along our path.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to ask my question and ask if you could submit the answer in writing to us later on, Ms. Vaccaro. Ms. Vaccaro, how do you believe the California Energy Commission is balancing different priorities, like getting offshore wind deployed while protecting and conserving coastal, ocean, and cultural resources? Unless our chairman allows you to answer that, I'll take that in writing. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back and leave it up to you if you'll allow that answer.
Short answer, 30 seconds. 25 seconds.
Thank you for that question, and I'd be happy to supplement the answer I'm about to give in writing as well. So the California Energy Commission is only one of several state agencies that are working to advance offshore wind. Pertinent to your question, California Coastal Commission, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Ocean Protection Council are our partner agencies. We're taking a whole of government approach here on offshore wind. California Coastal Commission recently, in reviewing the federal consistency determination by BOEM for the Morro Bay and Humboldt wind energy areas, issued a conditional concurrence and set forth 6 very important conditions that BOEM has agreed to include in the lease stipulations for the upcoming lease sale, each of which addresses potential impacts to marine and coastal resources, fishing industry, and the communities that depend on them, environmental justice. I'm getting the hand wave.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You can
Thank
finish
you.
this up in writing.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd now like
Mr.
to
Chair.
recognize Ms. Conway for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of my questions and thoughts have already been answered by the great questions from those that have already asked them, so I appreciate that. I'll try to be quick. Ms. Vaccaro, from the California Energy Commission perspective, I get that. I personally believe, everything we can, wind, solar, whatever it takes. I think I get concerned, as do some of my constituents in the Central Valley of California. We seem to be moving away from more traditional sources of power with the thought and the promise that we'll have new sources of power in the end. I'm just worried about that transitional period. I think, I don't know about all you all and where you are, but it's about 114 degrees, and it might be again right now where I live. And I feel like we're stepping away from traditional sources of power before we get to the point where this wind power would be available to us. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or not.
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, it is true that we are looking to transition away from fossil fuel generation, absolutely. And offshore wind is something that we're looking for, but that's a long lead time resource. And as we sit here today, though, there really is a focus on increasing, getting infrastructure on the ground now of renewable and clean energy technologies. That's more PV solar, that is more terrestrial wind. We're looking at hydrogen fuel cells, carbon capture, any number of different renewable and clean technologies, but these are things that are moving forward now. In this most recent budget, the legislature has authorized a faster path forward for the permitting of such projects. Energy Commission has been tasked to do that. And so I think we're still looking at thermal power plants. Geothermal, certainly increasing geothermal. There's a lot of focus right now, as you may be aware, on the known geothermal resource area in Imperial County, the southern end of the Salton Sea. So you're right. There is a transition away, and we are moving swiftly to do that, but not so swiftly that we don't recognize that right now there still is a need as we deal with emergencies such as this week.
Okay, well, I'll be watching. I also wonder about hydropower, but that's another question. Ms. Ortiz-Lage, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Or is it Lake?
Ortiz-Lage.
Okay.
It's a mouthful.
Dawn.
There you go. Thank you.
You mentioned the new workforce that's going to be required, and you're preparing for that. Will these be retrained workers or new workers? And housing, I caught something about housing, and I know the impacts here. I have been the beneficiary of owning property here, owning a home in Morro Bay for about 7 years that I don't get to nearly enough. Where are we going to put folks? It's impacted everywhere in California, but over here on the coast, it seems particularly impactful.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you very much. I think that we have this transition period. We do have a number of energy workers right now. However, I do think that with regards to what we're doing in preparation for the offshore wind industry is that we see opportunities in regards to all forms of labor. And so retraining the existing workforce that already live here is part of that equation. So that's very important. The housing piece is a piece that we at the county take very seriously, and utilizing some of the new legislation from the state, as well as what we want to do in as far as changing over our commercial properties into more of housing properties. There's a number of things that all have to be collaborated with. So it's part of the overall approach to looking for solutions, because we can't bring in workers without that housing piece. Thank you.
Thank you. I know I have just a few seconds left. So, Ms. Sage Walker, I'll take your comments. I'll chat with you after. Because real quickly, Assembly Member, I really appreciate the effort of the state to streamline efforts. I said in the past, in another life, in the state legislature, that I never met a CEQA exemption that I didn't want to vote for. Yes, I voted for every football stadium, the Kings, the basketball. I did all of that stuff. It was a CEQA exemption. All y'all, some of you were there with me. But I appreciate your commitment. But real quick about Diablo Canyon, 9%. Could it do more?
I don't think, without building another reactor, no. But that 9%, if you add the two reactors, it's the single largest producing energy asset in the state.
Yeah,
by a large margin.
I'm very interested in that, especially it's clean. And okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was almost on time.
Thank you, Ms. Conway. And now I recognize Representative Panetta for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sage Walker, has the Northern Chumash had enough time and resources to adequately respond to the proposed sale notice?
The short answer is no. And we're strictly volunteers on this project. So this is after hours, on the weekends, at nighttime, up all night, riding and taking time out of our work and our jobs to be here. And so that's the short answer. But the long answer is that we hope that like what Representative Carbajal suggested, is that we have long-term advisory councils and positions that are meaningful within the tribe, concrete in some of these lease sale applicants and permits.
Great. Thank you. Madam Supervisor, based on your long time experience in labor and obviously Diablo, do you see any crossover between the labor of Diablo and this type of project?
I think that there's tons of opportunity here in regards to the energy knowledge base that sits at Diablo, and the current extension to 2030 is really helpful for that. I also want to note that, interestingly enough, when we developed 800 megawatts of utility scale solar, it happened during the Great Recession. And at that point in time, we took people from the home building industry, which had gone dead, and turned them into energy workers. Careers change with this kind of uplift of an industry. So we have all the opportunity to do exactly that. We can just have a trajectory that's going to be very successful with not only new generation, but existing generation of workers. So it's all possible.
Great, thank you. And Assemblymember Cunningham, good to see you. And look forward to seeing you later today. I got to tell you, I realize that you are a longtime public servant here in this area. As you know, I've been getting down here a lot in the last 8 months, and I got to tell you, I've heard nothing but good things about your public service and what you do for this area. Knowing your connection to this area, what worries you the most about this project?
I would say probably my biggest concern is that I think the commitment's there. I think the lease auction will be very successful. I think that anytime you're trying to do something that requires a multitude of layers of state agency approval, coastal commission for, this is a coastal zone thing, state lands commission. Federally, I think we've got some strong backing with BOEM. But once you get into state waters and then start moving things inland, you're looking at tons of state agencies that have a review process. So without something, I think, in statute that declares the Morro Bay Call Area offshore wind project to be of utmost state importance and almost an emergency basis, my fear would be that any one state agency can have years of review, challenges to the final determination, subsequent litigation. So I think there's urgency here. I think our state energy grid needs it. I think, frankly, our planet needs it. So I would like to see something done on the state level to make sure that it's treated with the same urgency that we treated Diablo Canyon with earlier this month.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you for your service, and thanks to all the witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you, and that brings us to a close of this panel. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony, members for this round of questions, to all our witnesses. Members may have some additional questions for you. Don't run away. We may have additional questions for you, and we ask that you respond to them in writing. As I mentioned earlier, members will have 3 days following the hearing to submit written questions, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 days for the responses. Thank you. You've already gone. So before we transition to the next panel, I want to keep us going. Let's take a 1-minute stretch, everybody. All right, everybody else. Okay.
Is this your 7th inning stretch?
it's pretty difficult, sir.
It is.
It's a little like, recess.
And everybody knows everybody, and so, it's all
having a good time.
That's right.
Yeah.
They're glad to be here. All right, everyone back.
1 minute.
Come on, everyone have a seat. We have more questions to ask. We're not finished yet. This next panel is also, I think a lot of people have been waiting to hear, is on the fishing industry and ports. How, both of those have very critical questions that we need to understand if we're going to move forward, both fishing and ports. So I'm going to introduce the third panel of witnesses. Mr. Matthew Arms is the Director of Environmental Planning for my port, the Port of Long Beach. Mr. Arms, it's great to see you again here in Morro Bay. I'm now going to yield, as I have done quite frequently today, to my colleague, Mr. Carbajal, Representative Carbajal.
Thank you.
To introduce the rest of the witnesses.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. And again, I want to add to what Representative Panetta said earlier. I really want to thank you for your leadership. Some of you might think, since we've been working on offshore wind here, that it was my idea to have this hearing, and again, it wasn't. It was the chairman's leadership and initiative that really brought this hearing to the coast and to my district. So I want to thank him again for his leadership over the years, not only for this hearing, but for all that he's done for the state of California and our country. He's certainly has distinguished himself as a leader in Congress, and he's been a great mentor to me, so I'm very grateful for his work on this issue and for hosting this hearing here. With that, I especially want to thank Jeremiah O'Brien, Josh Boswell, and Supervisor Arnold for making themselves available to participate in this panel and to offer us their perspective and their comments and their testimony on this important issue. I am particularly interested in hearing from Mr. O'Brien on how the partnerships between the federal government and fishermen can continue, and from Mr. Boswell, I am looking forward to hearing about the positive economic impacts offshore wind can and will bring to our region. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and it's great to have all of our witnesses here. Mr. Arms, I'm going to begin right away and recognize you for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor and a privilege to testify before this subcommittee today to discuss the opportunity of West Coast ports to support offshore wind energy development and deployment. My name is Matt Arms, and I am Director of Environmental Planning at the Port of Long Beach. I'd also like to begin by recognizing Chairman Lowenthal, whose district includes the Port of Long Beach. Chairman Lowenthal has been a tireless advocate not only for the Port of Long Beach, but for all ports in the U.S. in his longtime role as co-chair of the Congressional Ports Caucus. As background, the Port of Long Beach is the premier U.S. gateway for trans-Pacific trade and a trailblazer in an innovative goods movement, infrastructure development, safety, and environmental stewardship. As the second busiest container seaport in the United States, the port handles trade valued at over $200 billion annually and supports 2.6 million jobs across the nation. We are building some of the most modern, efficient, and sustainable marine facilities in the world to accommodate bigger and bigger ships while generating thousands of jobs. At the same time, we are committed to a zero-emissions future, with goals to achieve zero-emission drayage trucks by 2035 and zero-emission human-operated cargo handling equipment by 2030. As part of our commitment to sustainability, we are also taking a hard look at how the port can support the development of offshore wind. We view offshore wind as a critical piece of the puzzle to meet future energy demand with green, reliable, and cost-effective electricity. Over the last year and a half, the port has engaged with federal, state, and private stakeholders to assess what landside infrastructure is needed to support offshore wind in California. And it's become clear that the required landside infrastructure does not currently exist. We are pleased that the state and federal government are taking a critical look at infrastructure needs. We look forward to continuing to coordinate with all parties and providing information to these essential studies. Among the challenges we face are that state law discourages the creation of new ports and the development of new heavy infrastructure outside of existing ports. Further, available land and terminal space in existing ports is extremely limited. California must begin planning now to address issues of sea space, environmental permitting, electrical transmission, port improvements, supply chain, and workforce training. Without an urgent and focused effort, lack of port infrastructure could hinder the development of this resource, thereby reducing the economic and environmental benefits of offshore wind deployment. We also encourage the continued engagement with all stakeholders to ensure that safe access routes for the movement of ocean-going vessels in and out of our ports is maintained. We have the opportunity, if we act now, to get this right from the start and to locate the needed facilities where they make the most sense. Large ports like Long Beach are experienced with building heavy marine infrastructure, and we should take advantage of those capabilities. To be successful, it will require a whole-of-government approach from federal, state, and local to site, permit, and fund facilities in the short time frame. In closing, the Port of Long Beach has significant capabilities in goods movement, infrastructure, safety, and environmental stewardship, and we are committed to leveraging that expertise and partnering with the public and private sector to better understand what is needed to develop the landside infrastructure to support development of a viable offshore wind resource in California. Furthermore, we view a comprehensive feasibility analysis to evaluate the development of landside infrastructure at the Port of Long Beach as a critical next step. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Arms. I now recognize Mr. Boswell for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you. Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, Congresswoman Conway, Congressman Carbajal, Congressman Panetta. Thank you for inviting me to testify on this critical topic for the Central Coast economy. My name is Josh Boswell, and I am VP of Policy and Economic Development for REACH, the Central Coast Regional Economic Action Coalition. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to create 15,000 good-paying jobs in SLO and Santa Barbara counties by 2030 and establish the Central Coast as a place where current and future generations can thrive. The energy sector is one of our region's largest sources of good-paying jobs, and the energy transition is having acute impacts. A key pillar of our work is evolving the region's role as an energy hub and leader in renewable energy. The Central Coast has critical energy assets to build upon. One of the world's largest energy storage projects is planned for Morro Bay, and we have one of the world's largest solar farms. Diablo Canyon has critical transmission infrastructure, and the region has developed a vision to gradually transform the site into a clean tech innovation park under Cal Poly SLO's leadership to support offshore wind, marine science, and renewable research. Vandenberg Space Force Base is largely powered by solar energy during the day, and UC Santa Barbara is a global leader in environmental and energy research. The Central Coast also has a world-class energy workforce. SLO and Santa Barbara counties are among the state's top 10 oil-producing counties, but refineries and offshore platforms are being decommissioned. Even with the short-term extension, Diablo Canyon will close in the coming years, and with it, our largest private sector employer. We are a microcosm of our nation's energy transition. Our community has the will to position the Central Coast as a hub for our renewables future, building on our role as an energy powerhouse and national environmental leader. We are organized, engaged, and planning proactively. It is important to show that the energy transition can happen here in a way that doesn't leave communities behind, and offshore wind is central to that effort. We know that offshore wind can deliver jobs and economic benefits. Last year, REACH released a study, as was noted before, of the economic benefits of a Morro Bay call area. This found that a 3-gigawatt wind farm could equate to over $260 million in annual economic impact and 650 long-term good-paying jobs, and over 1,000 for the state. The build-out of waterfront infrastructure would generate over $410 million in annual economic impact to the two counties and create over 2,000 jobs over a 5-year project. These benefits depend on developing the onshore infrastructure to support offshore wind here on the Central Coast. Otherwise, it is possible that our region could supply the critical transmission infrastructure necessary for our state and nation's renewables goals, but be left behind by the energy transition. We know from industry roundtables that there is broad agreement that waterfront infrastructure on the Central Coast is necessary, recognizing the importance of close proximity to the wind energy area. With support from SLO and Santa Barbara counties and the city of Morro Bay, REACH is leading a study to provide a clear roadmap of where, how, and when waterfront infrastructure on the Central Coast can be enhanced to support offshore wind, including for assembly, operations and maintenance, and other essential activities. This study will be finalized in the coming weeks. We are coordinating with regional stakeholders and state and federal efforts. We appreciate the leadership of the CEC, the State Lands Commission, BOEM, and other agencies, and are eager to do our part to support these planning efforts. As we have advanced our analysis from desk research to local engagement and site visits, the infrastructure options here appear even more promising. The Central Coast, including the city of Morro Bay, is in a prime position to support the development of offshore wind. We know the East Coast is rapidly scaling up a network of infrastructure, supply chains, and manufacturing. Europe is even further ahead. California's bold planning goals of at least 25 gigawatts by 2045 demand a similar West Coast effort. We are eager to work together and play our part. The state legislature is making critical investments that can help make this Central Coast vision a reality, including $1 million to SLO County to advance port planning into next year, in addition to $45 million recently approved for offshore wind infrastructure, $160 million for economic development and conservation at Diablo Canyon, and $1 billion for a new clean energy reliability investment plan. The federal government is also a critical partner. First, we must ensure that federal investments in offshore wind are coordinated with affected communities. We are mapping out the concrete ways to enhance infrastructure, catalyze research, and develop the workforce. Federal partnership and investment is essential. Second, the government must establish a final sale notice that supports affected communities, mitigates impacts, and advances jobs goals. In particular, the bidding credit for community benefit agreements should be significantly increased to support the fishing community as an important part of the Central Coast's economic fabric, as well as a general bidding credit to promote job creation, education, and build community trust. Finally, we must all work in concert to advance our state and nation's ambitious goals. The discussions leading to the Morro Bay wind energy area demonstrated the power of collaboration to work through complex issues. We appreciate Congressman Carbajal and Congressman Panetta's leadership in this effort. We hope this serves as inspiration as we embark on this next phase of advancing offshore wind. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Boswell. I now recognize Mr. O'Brien for 5 minutes of testimony.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the House Committee on Natural Resources and Committee on Energy and Mineral Resources. My name is Jeremiah O'Brien, and I'm a Vice President of the Morro Bay Commercial Fishermen's Organization and a member of the Morro Bay Harbor Board, Advisory Board. As many of you know, those of us in the fishing industry have been in discussion with various energy developers for the past 7 years and have met with various degrees of success, in some cases less in others. We do not want people to think that mitigation means acceptance of the harm that this will cause to our industry and our community. It does not. Mitigation is a desperate tool for existence and survival in the near future, and continued build out of these facilities will cause permanent damage to the commercial fishing industry on the coasts of the United States. There is no amount of money that will save the eventual destruction or solve the related problems. It's not money. As we lose more areas over time, coupled with the areas that we have already lost to environmental and governmental restrictions, we will be moving our fishermen further and further into a shrinking ocean, meaning that will cause a loss of income and a loss of harvestable fish stocks as more and more boats converge on an ever-shrinking area. The fishing industry is comprised of hardy, strong, and brave men and women, but the industry itself and what holds it together is a very delicate system of suppliers, parts, facilities, processing, and community workers. And it goes on. We ship our harvest worldwide, and its contribution to help our trade imbalance is extremely important to our economy. This all constitutes a very delicate balance, And if one area is affected, it adversely affects and reverberates through other areas in the system. When one link of this chain is broken, it can be devastating to many other segments of the community near and far from the sea. The echoing effect on taking of these areas will be comprehensively addressed and analyzed so you know exactly what this trade for ocean resources is really worth. A complete and total economic report should be the first thing we do, a fair report, an in-the-weeds report should be the first thing we do to help understand this trade for power for food. We got to figure out what it's actually costing the American people. We need to analyze the losses of accessibility in these areas and the impacts to the communities in these areas and all related shore-based economic impacts. I say this because never before have we had to trade valuable resources such as food security and economic loss to gain other resources such as electricity. In the past, we've had things like steam, coal, fossil fuel, solar, wind, nuclear power, all of these things, but we've never had to trade for them. So we're now trading a valuable resource, such as food, to make gains on our power grid. These others have come at a relatively cheap price where we are not losing other resources. Also, in this regard, we'll need to come up with a figure, a number, or a cost to the final consumer. What is mom and dad going to pay to stick a piece of toast in the toaster and hit the button? Nobody has mentioned the final cost to the ratepayer. It's our contention that the cost will burden the American people at a time when housing, food, transportation costs are soaring. This will add much pain and suffering to those already feeling oppressed and lead to further homelessness in America. Wind energy industries speak of gains and claims of employment. We need an economic impact report so that we can see the true gains and, most importantly, the true losses. What is this trade that we're making? The food security issue that I brought up must be discussed in modern terms, such as farmland in the West suffering devastating droughts, their futures in our food production, that coupled, well, I'll end it there.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I now recognize Supervisor Arnold for 5 minutes of testimony.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak with you today. I am Debbie Arnold, and I'm a supervisor here in San Luis Obispo County representing the 5th District. I want to welcome you to San Luis County, and I'm excited to be here talking energy opportunities. As you've heard, San Luis Obispo County has a long history and a very good track record for getting energy projects across the finish line. We have experience working with energy providers and state and federal agencies to provide locations for new and innovative types of energy. We're home to Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant in the western part of our county and to 2 major solar farms in the eastern part of our county. And now we're being considered for an offshore wind farm. In anticipation of this discussion, the county has already been working with our economic partners. Cal Poly and Reach, who you've just heard from, have been involved. And in May of this year, just this past May, the Board of Supervisors unanimously supported funding for a waterfront infrastructure study. We want to know how to make offshore wind a good fit for our county. And we know that thanks to PG&E, we already have a robust transmission infrastructure in our county, but we would need to construct port infrastructure. Studies show that it's very doable. A Cal Poly study recently showed considerable opportunity for job and economic output if a port is established here locally. All that being said, now I want to put on the hat, my hat of a local elected official and do what I think is my most important job today, and that is to share with you the questions and concerns that I hear from my constituents. By getting these questions and concerns into the record today, I hope they will be addressed as plans move forward. So first, I have questions and concerns about the onshore infrastructure needed to support a wind farm. Second, when a wind farm is fully operational, I'm concerned about the impact and damage to the ecosystem, especially seabirds and migrating whales. That is a constant theme that comes through constituents to, I'm sure, all of the supervisors here in the county. Third, I have questions about whether wind farms can provide dependable baseline power 24/7. Additionally, we need to know more about battery storage, specifically whether it will be necessary, and if so, how the hazardous waste associated with the batteries will be addressed. And finally, and maybe most importantly, I question how a proposed wind farm will affect our fishing industry. I also want to say and share with you that I find it challenging to promote policy that forces the closure of a locally operating nuclear power plant while simultaneously advocating for the construction of a wind farm. Ultimately, the ratepayers, who are citizen taxpayers, will be paying millions of dollars to decommission Diablo Canyon and millions of dollars more to construct a wind farm. I understand California has an energy shortage that needs to be addressed, and I believe a wind energy farm off our coast could help solve this bipartisan challenge, but only if we consider the public's concerns. I hope that the policy decisions promoted today will be effective in helping to provide reliable, affordable, and abundant clean energy now and into the future. And again, I thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel discussion.
Thank you, Supervisor Arnold, and thank all the panelists for your testimony. Now's the time that we're going to go into the questioning by members, and I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions, and I'm going to start with my own from the Port of Long Beach, Mr. Arms. Matt, there are a number of unanswered questions about how California ports are going to handle offshore wind and the associated supply chain. How is, maybe a little bit more detail, and is the Port of Long Beach positioning itself to be one of those key ports or not? Is it, we all watched the lineup of ships that were out there and the congestion in the ports to begin with. How is this going to be impacted, deal with the issue of congestion and space? Is the port really seriously considering itself?
So I'll take the second part. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. I'll take the second part of the question first. So there's often a misconception that congestion and capacity are the same thing. The recent congestion over the last couple of years that ports around the world have seen is a supply chain issue that is worldwide and global. And it has to do with disruptions to the supply chain from China to Chicago, and it's causing backlogs throughout the system. That is separate and different from, and those issues need to be addressed. That is separate and different from the capacity of a port such as Long Beach and the capacity that we have to move our cargo and to bring in other uses. So I just kind of want to separate those two issues. In terms of how we see offshore wind, I think that for the reasons I stated in my testimony, we ourselves are moving to zero emissions and relying more on the grid and electrification, especially as we saw over the last couple of weeks. We absolutely see that a strong, green, renewable, reliable, cost-effective grid for California is important, and we see this as a piece of that. And so as a major seaport, a leading seaport, not only in the state but around the world, we want to do our part to help the state in that effort. So if that is us partnering with other ports, the state, the federal government, to understand how ports operate, how ports build in California, what the business plan is, we're happy to have those conversations and contribute to the conversation. If it means there's a role of the Port of Long Beach to play in some type of facility in the Port of Long Beach, we absolutely want to explore that. We think that is very possible, given the unique nature of Long Beach in terms of our infrastructure, our location, lack of wind, calm waters. There could be pieces that really fit well with Long Beach, and we want to explore that.
Thank you very much. My question is for Mr. O'Brien. Thank you for your testimony, especially what you see as the trade-off between food security and power needs. But at the beginning of your testimony, you said you did have some discussions with developers and you had varying degrees of success, you mentioned. Can you describe some of those successes? You've already told us, I think, what you see as some of the other issues that are involved and what we need to do. But tell us a little bit about what kind of successes the fishing industry has had with developers.
The successes were in the form of mitigation efforts. And so we have had some successful mitigation efforts, particularly with Castle Wind, who is one of the main developers. And these successes we're proud of. They took many years, many give and take, much give and take on both sides. But I also mentioned in that mitigation is not acceptance of this. Mitigation is a struggle. So it's a struggle for our people to hang on for the near future, and we'll have to see what long-term effects are. But mitigation, as I said, is not an acceptance. It's just a struggle to stay alive.
Thank you. So as this solution, as we move forward, you said you would like to see a much more complete analysis of those impacts before we do anything. Can you describe that?
Certainly, thank you. So I think that what is needed here, because I've heard mixed messages. I've heard emergency, the word emergencies come up, and the need for the power, and we all recognize that. And we certainly are one of the groups who do recognize it. But we need to do an extensive economic report. So to see just what everybody's talking about, we've heard a gain of so many jobs. Well, I'm not going to argue that, but we're going to have a loss of jobs. So we're trading. This is a trade. We're making a trade here where we haven't had to do this in the past. So we're going to create losses in many other areas, not just the fishing industry, but shore-based industry. So we need to find out, what are we trading for? So we're giving this up, but we're getting this. So are we really going to have cheap power for the people? What is the cost of this power going to be for as I said earlier, mom and dad? We need to do this economic report, get into the weeds, dig deep, get it all.
I don't mean to cut you off, but we've kind of gone over, and you've given us you've laid out how you see this, and the opportunities and also the liabilities without having this economic analysis. So with that, I'm going to recognize Ranking Member Stauber for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Arms, thanks for your testimony and thanks for your leadership at the Port of Long Beach. I normally don't put witnesses on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. So I represent northeastern Minnesota, and on the western tip of Lake Superior is the most inland port in this country. Can you name it?
I cannot. I apologize.
It's the port of Duluth, and that's where our iron ore shipments and our wind turbines come in through. The port of Duluth is, and I was a board member on the port of Duluth, so your expertise and the chairman's support of your port is extremely important as we, move and talk about this transition. And I just want to share with you, and we need your support on this, the Sulaks in Michigan. At the eastern tip of Lake Superior are important for our industry. We need your port association to support that. I believe you do, but please don't forget about the most inland port in our country, because it is important. That brings the harvest, the materials to the Midwest. And thank you for your service. I appreciate that. Mr. Arnold, Ms. Arnold, thank you for joining us. Offshore wind requires significant build-out of transmission infrastructure. What are some of your concerns with the construction process?
My concerns with the construction process, I don't know that I have any big concerns about that. I mentioned in my little talk here that we've been through this before. We've built one of the we've been through this before. We built in this mid-sized small coastal county one of the major nuclear power plants on the west coast of the United States. So we never had issues. The workforce came. Both the construction and the staffing of that power plant, we just have never had problems. And in fact, it became a big part of our county's economy and really integrated, into the county here. So I don't anticipate that we would have problems. Maybe our location exactly between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and you've all admitted that it's a nice place to be. We attract the people, and we so far haven't had the problems. Same thing with the solar farms. We had, and that was more of just a temporary workforce, but the construction went along fine, and we had the people here.
Wind and solar energy are intermittent power sources, meaning commercial battery storage facilities are needed to store energy. So it's available when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. What issues do you anticipate with building and maintaining battery storage in the area?
Well, I just wonder about that, and because this is a new industry and this is kind of a new proposal. And again, we've been through. In some ways, these are the same. There are similar questions to the construction of Diablo, the safety of the battery storage and the disposal of the hazardous waste. I mean, slightly different than a nuclear plant, but basically the same concerns. So I think that we're all learning and trying to figure this out, and I'm sure there'll be studies and assessments. How safe is it to store these batteries? And how do we dispose of the hazardous waste?
Yeah. Two more questions, one for you and one for Mr. O'Brien. Battery storage requires massive amounts of battery metals. Do you support using our vast mineral wealth here in America, and in particular Minnesota?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, Mr. O'Brien, you bring up a very important piece of the conversation about transitioning, maybe moving the commercial fisher men and women out, reducing the jobs. When we reshore manufacturing, we bring on average 7 jobs to that, and our mining community brings 3 to 4 jobs. The secondary jobs to your industry are critically important, and I want to thank you for bringing that up, because some people miss that. Some people seem to be focused on the conversation without the economic benefits, the secondary jobs down the line. And I think it's critically important that you have a voice and a say in these wind farms that are coming to the West Coast. And I really appreciate you being here. Mr. Chair, I used up 5 seconds more because they had to change microphones. And I yield back.
Well, thank you for being so observant. I now recognize Mr. Carbajal for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Boswell, what economic impacts would come to the region beyond manufacturing and construction by offshore wind? I know you've touched on this already, but if you could elaborate a little further.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think, as you noted, depending on the activities, construction, operation and development, decommissioning of the wind farms, we're looking at a variety of different career fields: water, transportation, construction, engineering, professional, scientific areas. I think in terms of the economic impacts, we're talking about good-paying jobs, $80,000 to $90,000 a year in income, a highly unionized sector. Again, when we're talking about, we're not just making widgets here, we're actually creating good, high-quality jobs in a sustainable industry that we want this region, this state, this country to be a global leader in. I think there's opportunities to tie in our universities to really advance the innovation associated with this sector as well. So I see a broad array of opportunities.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, how could conversations with the federal government and the offshore wind industry improve to account for industry impacts, particularly our fishermen?
Well, one of the ways, Congressman, they could improve is recently BOEM has awarded, if you will, considerations, and they had 20% for union workers. Now, I'm not knocking that. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. That's a wonderful thing. But those people will be the people that gain. They're going to gain employment, and they get a 20% consideration on their bid. The fishing industry got a 2.5% consideration, and we'll be losing. So how the math was done on that leaves the fishing industry a little bit troubled. So the losers get 2.5%, and the winners get 20%. So that is one of the ways, and frankly, we feel that the government thus far in this whole situation has taken the commercial fishing industry and food produced by the industry much too lightly. And they fail to realize the importance of supplying one of the nation's healthiest proteins available to this country. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. That was very helpful. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
First time he's been, without another question. I now recognize Ms. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all of you for being here. And I know you've been here for the other panels, and so thanks for hanging out and staying with us. I had just a couple of quick questions. Mr. Boswell, I'm curious about, I know I'm hearing a lot about all these jobs that are going to be created. Will they be ongoing? I mean, in my mind, it seems like it'll be like a rush of jobs to get this done and get that done, but then what will be left? Maintenance jobs? What happens to the workforce when we're through with all of that? They move on somewhere else, or how does that work?
No, thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think it's a really important one. I would say based on the research that we've done, I'd say number one, we know this is an industry that can create good long-term jobs. We know that's not the case with all forms of renewable energy, so I think that's an important point. I think you're right, there can be spikes associated with some of that employment. We know the construction of waterfront infrastructure, for example, would be time limited to the kind of the build-out of that, whereas the actual development and maintenance and decommissioning of a wind farm would be more consistent. I would say, though, I think the fact that our state has set a 25 gigawatt goal by 2045, we're creating a big market potentially. And so I think the bolder we aim, the more likely it is that those jobs can be longer term and self-sustaining.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Brien, when you said food, my ears picked up. Obviously, I'm a fan of food. But also the area that I represent in the Central California, food is much under siege, we believe. I understand you can get it elsewhere, other countries, other places. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not trusting of that. I mean, I know what we do here and how we do it. Safe, secure. I often wonder with foreign produce of any kind, how did they get it? What's in it? And maybe that's just my suspicious nature. But I very much, I worry about that. And I realize that, in the future, things may change, but I'm sort of all about like right now. If we put your industry out of business, I feel like the fishing industry, and maybe it's just my perception, has been shrinking anyway. It's down to only a few places where it, is still thriving. And of course, there's the ebb and flow of that, and I get that. But, I'm just thinking about a fishing boat. I've gone out and certainly not do what you do, but pretended to be a fisherman at my husband's request, almost to my regret, because I didn't catch anything. But, your boat runs what kind of power? A battery is not going to power a fishing boat, I don't think. I don't know what size battery that's going to be. I don't know where all this power is going to go. So I'm kind of rambling. I just want you to know that, I am listening, and I hope people understand, as I feel about the agricultural production in the Central Valley. When it's gone, it's gone. There's no, we'll bring it back after a while. I just don't see that. I really hope there is great consideration taken, when this happens. Maybe your industry can be helpful in saying, hey, don't put it right on top of where we fish. Put them down the road. And maybe that's just putting off the issue. But I want you to know some of us are very concerned about that and concerned about the issues that you brought up. So I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
And Supervisor Arnold, you said a word that really, am I out of time? Oh, okay. When you said taxpayers, boy, that just gets my bells and whistles going, because sometimes I just don't know if the powers that be are really paying attention to that. And it has maybe nothing to do with what we're doing here, but the price of gas, and I've put about 7,000 miles on my car in the past couple of months due to my husband's health. But pulling up to the pump, it's not the fun that it used to be, and yet we want to phase that out. I don't know. I just see it getting worse, and taxpayers need to have a say. One of my used to be favorite sayings in the legislature was, I do represent special interest. My one and only special interest group are the tax-paying citizens in the state of California. So, how do we get this right with taxpayers? I get that we want to get in the future. I think we need all sources, but I am worried in the interim, before we get from here to there, what do we do about the taxpayers? I just feel like they're leaving our state. They're not happy. I sure hope people are taking it into consideration.
And I'll just say something that you mentioned something earlier about, now it's slipping my mind, but I want to say my comments were really intended to say that, you mentioned something before about you're into all energy. If it works, let's get it on board, because we know as Californians and across the country and places, our energy's become less dependable, less affordable, and we're short. When we're having blackouts, we're short, right? So my comments were intended to kind of go there. It takes a lot of money to decommission a nuclear plant, a lot of money, and eventually that trickles down to the ratepayers in some way or another, and I call them taxpayers as well. And so I'm just saying, while we're looking to add more energy projects into our portfolio, let's take a rethink on why we're decommissioning perfectly good and operating energy projects that we've already been through all of this exercise to get up and running.
And I appreciate that. We're purchasing power by way of oil and gas from other countries that do not care about the environment. We do it cleaner, faster, better, because we have great laws to protect that. And I would just worry about all of that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Conway. I now recognize Representative Panetta for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boswell, obviously you heard about the 800-pound gorilla of the Long Beach port and what they can do. and their amazing capabilities, which obviously being from California, we're very proud of. But hearing what Long Beach can offer, is there anything here on the Central Coast that could compare, not necessarily to being a Long Beach port, but can being a specific port for this type of project?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I'll say a couple things. One, I don't want to prejudge the results of our study that's underway and will be done shortly. I will say, though, that we know proximity matters. We've heard that multiple times in terms of keeping the turbines, maximizing their time in the water, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from kind of the back and forth movement of vessels. And so we know the Central Coast options are the best in terms of just practicality. I think we've seen, and as we've kind of ground truthed our research, the options here are very promising, and so we do believe there is an opportunity to build out infrastructure right here. I will say more broadly, though, we understand this is a networked approach, and I think there's going to be opportunity across the West Coast for collaboration in this effort.
Thank you. Supervisor Arnold, thank you for your service. You have, I think, as you mentioned, a couple of massive solar projects in your supervisorial district, correct?
Correct.
One of them is the Hearst solar project.
Hearst isn't in mine. Carissa Plains is my district.
Got it. With the solar projects that you do have in your district, and you talked about some of the environmental concerns that you're hearing about from your constituents. Based on the fact that you have these solar projects in your district, are there any environmental concerns that you have in regards to that come up in regards to this project, the wind development project?
Yeah, for me it was just that, and this was all discussed during the permitting stages of the solar farms as well. That the panels, and in the case of the wind, which is kind of new to me, and I'm learning as we go along, but the wind farms and the need for the batteries. But both of those things eventually, at the end of their shelf life, create hazardous waste that needs to be disposed of. And just thinking, bringing that up as a consideration, that we do need to be prepared for that. We know that at the very beginning stages of building the nuclear plant, there was supposed to be a place to go with that nuclear waste, and that all changed on us, right? So just to consider, maybe have Plan B, or at least understand that the waste that we're creating eventually needs to be disposed of somehow or another.
Understood. Thank you. And then, Mr. O'Brien, you talked a lot about the qualities of fishermen and the fishermen industry and the people in the fishermen industry, which we all appreciate greatly. Do me a favor and give us an idea about the quantity of the fishermen here in the industry here. Give us some numbers if you could.
If you're talking about Morro Bay itself?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Morro Bay, well, our organization has 90 members. Each of those members are small business people. We do not represent the entire group of fishermen here. We represent the majority of the fishermen here. And each of those fishermen have employees in their business, and it ranges anywhere from 0 to 3. For our port, it's small. We do have an economic report that the last one came out in 2017. I've made them available to all of our local politicians. It's a very comprehensive book. Unfortunately, we haven't had one through COVID and so forth, because COVID has been devastating to the business. All the restaurants had closed, of course. But I would be happy to make that available to you. I know Mr. Carbajal has a copy or so, but we would make that available to you if you'd like.
Outstanding. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. And I thank the witnesses. This brings to a conclusion this round of questions. This concludes our third panel. As I've mentioned during the first two panels, members may have more questions to ask you. They'll put that in writing. They will have 3 business days in order to do that, to get them in writing, and you will have 10 business days to respond. Thank you again for you, and you're free to go, but you're also welcome to stay. And and listen to the rest of the hearing. And we're now going to transition to our fourth and final panel. I know you're all disappointed that we're not going to have another 4 or 5 panels, but we're just going to. I'd like to begin the fourth panel. You're learning so fast, coming back on me. That was it. Our fourth panel.
You gotta take bang that cap, Mr. Chair.
Hello, everybody. Let's just finish up our fourth panel. This is on industry, labor, environmental, and small businesses. We have 4 representatives. That's what we're going to do. And I appreciate everybody kind of returning to their seats. And let's begin. I'm going to introduce 2 of the witnesses, and my dear colleague, Representative Carbajal, is going to introduce 2 of the witnesses. So I'm going to introduce first, and I'm going to jump around, and then he's going to. My first witness that I'm introducing is Mr. Adam Stern, who is the Executive Director of Offshore Wind California. So that's one of the people I'm going to introduce. And I'm also going to introduce Mr. Eddie Ahn, who is the Executive Director for Brightline Defense. Thank you, the two of you, and now I turn it over to Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we move on to our last panel, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's hearing to learn more about offshore wind as we continue to develop this new industry off our coastline. I'm pleased that Mr. Simonin is with us, business manager with the IBEW Local 639, and look forward to hearing from you specifically about how we can prepare and ensure our workforce to take advantage of this new industry and make sure we are creating good paying jobs. Developing offshore wind has the potential to be a true win-win for our local economies and energy goals. Mr. Berg, founder of Calwise Spirits Company and president of the Distillers of San Luis Obispo County, thank you for also making yourself available and to come here today, and I look forward to hearing from you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And so I'm going to begin first with Mr. Stern. You're now recognized for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. I'm Adam Stern, Executive Director of Offshore Wind California, a trade group that represents the offshore wind industry in our state. Last month, as others have observed, the California Energy Commission approved a bold set of planning goals to put the state on a path to go big on floating offshore wind and responsibly develop up to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and a nation-leading 25 gigawatts by 2045. And at the federal level, Congress also passed an historic set of climate measures that go big on clean energy, including steps to advance the President's national goal to generate 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. These are important achievements. But meeting these planning goals has become even more urgent. As we've all experienced this past week, heat waves and the climate crisis are forcing California to take extreme action to address risks to our electric grid and ensure reliability. Indeed, the Earth is facing a climate emergency, not sometime in the distant future, but now. Offshore wind is ready to be a major part of the climate solution in California. The Golden State is poised to add this new renewable technology to its diverse clean power portfolio as a complement to our existing solar, onshore wind, battery storage, geothermal, and other energy resources. So what does going big on offshore wind mean? First, it means moving ahead with BOEM's plans for an initial lease auction this fall for the Morro Bay and Humboldt wind energy areas. On transmission, it means siting, permitting, and building power lines to transmit 25 gigawatts of offshore wind power to load centers in North, Central, and Southern California. We have a good start here at Morro Bay, which has access to existing transmission capacity of up to 5 to 6 gigawatts, according to the state ISO. In addition, we will still need substantially more transmission capacity and an improved process to build it. We also need to work with BOEM and NOAA to ensure power generated at Morro Bay can reach shore in the context of the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. On port infrastructure, it means planning a multi-port strategy that includes the port of Humboldt Bay on the north coast and ports that can deploy and service offshore wind off the central coast. Development of ports and transmission are excellent initiatives that could be supported with federal and state infrastructure funding. On new call areas, it means starting work with BOEM and other interested parties to identify new areas for the next rounds of leasing to help reach California's goal of 25 gigawatts by 2045. As part of this process, we're committed to ensuring that offshore wind has a minimal impact on the environment and coexists well with local communities, marine life, and all other ocean users. On procurement, the CEC, CPUC, and other state agencies need to work together to provide procurement at scale for the power offshore wind will generate. Such action will be important to create more market certainty for developers and investors. On workforce development, the CEC, GoBiz, and other agencies must begin job training programs for the tens of thousands of workers who will install and service offshore wind turbines. On permitting, the CEC, the Coastal Commission, the State Lands Commission, and other state and federal agencies must coordinate on a clear roadmap that provides greater certainty for completing environmental and other necessary reviews in an efficient and timely manner. And for a sustainable supply chain, it means advancing all of the above at scale to attract a wide range of businesses and investment to the state to service and supply this new clean energy industry, which will generate tens of thousands of jobs and tens of billions of dollars in GDP for California. In summary, we intend to develop a thriving, world-leading floating offshore wind industry for California and the United States. We're committed to working with federal and state agencies and local leaders and stakeholders to realize as quickly as possible the benefits of this important renewable energy resource to the Golden State. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stern. We now recognize Mr. Simonin for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee, Mr. Simonin.
Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the Energy Mineral Resources Committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today. My name is Mark Simonin, and I am the business manager with IBEW Local 639 in San Luis Obispo County. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the important role that union labor, our construction industry contractor partners, and jointly administered apprenticeship training programs have in unlocking offshore wind energy on the West Coast and around the country. I began my career with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers in 1988 with IBEW Local 103 in Boston, Massachusetts, where I completed a telecommunications apprenticeship. I later transferred to IBEW Local 639 in San Luis Obispo, and in 1997 completed the electrical apprenticeship program and became a journeyman inside wireman. That same year, I took on my first leadership role in the union when I was elected to the executive board. I continued to work as a journeyman inside wireman until 2010, when I first became the union business manager for Local 639. Since 2010, I have also served on the boards of several local and regional labor councils and joint apprenticeship and training committees. As the business manager for IBEW Local 639, I have seen firsthand how our members have been instrumental in the successful construction of renewable energy projects. Time and time again, my local and other IBEW locals in the region have come together to provide the workforce necessary to build these projects here on the Central Coast. An example is Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Station, where 850 IBEW electricians work during construction. Another example would be the Topaz Solar Farm, the largest solar farm in the world at the time of construction. At the project's peak, we were providing all the necessary manpower for that project, while at the same time also providing electricians to build the California Valley Solar Ranch. It is essential to understand that many union construction members can and do travel for work. The construction industry by nature involves moving from job to job and project to project, and many IBEW and other union members make their living by traveling, sometimes great distances, to provide the necessary members of qualified electricians where they are needed. In short, this is simply what we do. Together with our IBEW brothers and sisters throughout the region, we can and will provide the necessary workforce of qualified electricians to successfully build offshore wind energy infrastructure here on the Central Coast, just as we have for countless projects before and as we will for countless projects to come. But we need strong labor policies and specifically project labor agreements to make sure offshore wind developers cannot simply bring in low-cost labor from out of state or overseas to build these projects. Our apprenticeship programs are well equipped to respond to the needs of the market by taking in new apprentices and as the demand increases. Our ability to do so is limited only by the number of projects we are engaged to build. Joint apprenticeship training committees, or JATCs, like the ones that I sit on, are made up of equal numbers of union trustees and management trustees. The management trustees are the contractors who employ our members. Because our apprentices earn wages and benefits on the job training, our programs can only accept as many apprentices as we know we can have on the jobs. And I will tell you, for this reason, our programs and union apprenticeship programs around the country are often forced to reject vastly more apprentice applicants than we can accept. Because again, our ability to take in new apprentices is limited only by the number of projects we are engaged to build. Project labor agreements are the single signal that our apprenticeship training committees look for when they decide how many apprentices to accept. If we know that our union members and electrical contractors will get the work, we can take in more apprentices and ensure a steady supply of skilled electricians on these and other clean energy projects. Meeting the challenges of the climate crisis requires that offshore wind and other clean energy development is carried out by a highly skilled and trained workforce who can complete projects safely, on time, and on budget. As we transition to the new forms of energy, it is essential that we protect public investments in energy infrastructure as well as workforce building and infrastructure. Project labor agreements have a proven track record of achieving both of these goals, while also producing substantial and far-reaching economic and social benefits. With the right policies in place, we have an unprecedented opportunity here on the West Coast to not only become a global leader in offshore wind, but to light the path to a union-built clean energy industry throughout the United States. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Simonin. I now recognize Mr. Ahn for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal and Ranking Member Stauber and members of the subcommittee. My name is Eddie Ahn. I'm the Executive Director of Brightline Defense. It's an environmental justice nonprofit, and we try to do two things, and two things well, which is one, policy legal research as it pertains to environmental issues, including clean energy like offshore wind, as well as direct services to frontline communities that we really do care about. And these services include anything from air quality monitoring, job training, youth leadership, and many more programs for frontline communities. When it comes to offshore wind, we're very excited about the potential for offshore wind and what it can provide to the state. Of course, clean energy, clean air, by reducing our reliance on particularly fossil fuel infrastructure. We're also excited about the equity components of offshore wind, making sure that there's local hiring on these projects and jobs for underemployed, unemployed communities in our state. And generally, we've been working a lot with the Coalition Offshore Wind Now, which spearheaded AB 525, the state legislative framework. You heard earlier today from Assemblymember Cunningham, who talked about his work with Assemblymember David Chu and pushing this through our state legislature. And you also heard from Commissioner Vaccaro about how it set this massive 25 gigawatt target for the state and really put forward this vision that we all want to see in that Offshore Wind Now coalition I just mentioned. It was with a labor stakeholder, Operating Engineers Local 3. There was an environment stakeholder, Environment California. And finally, Brightline acted as the environmental justice pillar. So you can start to see how there's cross-sector support for something like offshore wind and how we want to see essentially more of everything with that 25 gigawatt target. We want to see not only more clean energy, we want to see more jobs, we want to see more infrastructure. We also want to see more community benefits, more equity, and finally, and perhaps more importantly, identification of appropriate wind energy areas to make sure this technology can work across the entire West Coast. And to that end, you've heard again from all the witnesses today, the vision for making sure we have an expanded bidding credit system through the proposed sale notice that's been put forward by BOEM. And that, Commissioner Vaccaro, for instance, from the California Energy Commission talked about how it should be up to 50% and how we should be considering onshore communities when we're talking about community benefits. You've also seen federal leadership, such as yourselves. There was, for instance, the July 29th, 2022 letter from Congress members Lowenthal, Carbajal, Huffman, and Panetta, talking about how expanding bid credits for CBAs is really important, community benefits agreements, as well as making sure we expand that definition of what communities can benefit from offshore wind in the first place. It should be onshore communities who will essentially experience the impacts that are ongoing, whether it's transmission, battery storage, and much more associated with it. And we would like to appreciate BOEM for getting us a long part of the way there. There's been significant engagement on the part of this agency that we haven't seen in the past, and we'd like to encourage all federal government leadership to recognize that there are significant legal, statutory foundations for making sure we can incentivize things like project labor agreements that were talked about, also things like a regional community benefit and regional tribal capacity funds that can exist to make sure that ongoing community engagement can happen as these projects go up over a very long period of time. And finally, I think the important thing to note about all this is that there's hopefully a larger vision in which we make sure that offshore wind is a source of clean energy that reduces our reliance on ultimately diesel and gas power plants that exist in the state. Even over the last few days, as heat waves have swept this state and really strained our power grid, it's ultimately environmental justice communities that suffer the most, typically low-income communities, low-income households who are sited or just nearby these power plants, and they're fired up around the clock as a result, and they experience those poor air quality impacts. And we'd really like to see this expanded vision that state agencies have put forward for essentially 25% of the state's energy supply, and making sure we can eventually move our communities forward to this clean energy vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahn. I now recognize our final witness, Mr. Berg, for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Uh-oh, having issues again?
Thank you for your testimony. We now.
Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and committee members, thank you for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to provide a voice for those who are too often left voiceless during the policymaking process, small business owners. I'm the owner of Calwise Spirits Company, a craft distillery with a small restaurant and bar in Paso Robles. I also serve as the president of the Distillers of San Luis Obispo County. I'm one of the many business owners that comprise a significantly large beverage industry in California, and we are also very large users of energy. Our Golden State's population is expected to grow. It is vital that we produce enough energy to sustain our growth and small businesses that comprise the backbone of the 5th largest economy in the world. About 6 weeks ago, my business experienced a power outage. My machinery stopped running and we couldn't manufacture any more product for the rest of the day. My lights, refrigerators, and payment processing systems shut off and we couldn't serve our customers. We lost potential sales and our tight production schedule was delayed by a full day. If I had had active fermentations at the time, it would have been even worse. There are thousands of wineries, breweries, and distilleries in California that rely on electricity to cool fermentations. If the electricity goes out, the entire batch will spoil, resulting in significant losses for our businesses. Similarly, restaurants and grocery stores also need refrigeration to keep their running so their stock doesn't spoil, and hospitals need power to operate their life-saving equipment. The wind will probably blow hard enough to generate enough power 99% of the time, but if there is no nuclear energy or natural gas as a backup, it will only take one unusually breezeless day during a heat wave to wreak utter havoc on the grid. Beyond the importance of energy reliability and ecology, affordability is crucial to ensure social equity and economic success. After payroll and raw materials, energy is my 3rd largest variable cost for my business, and it continues to skyrocket. Since last year, my electricity rate has increased a whopping 23%. Rising energy prices are one of the main causes of our current historic inflation rate. Overall, my electricity rate has increased over 50% in just the past 4 years. I'm a huge proponent of sustainability and work to incorporate its principles in my operation. But for an activity to be sustainable, it needs to satisfy the 3 E's requirements: ecology, equity, and economy. I think good arguments can be made that wind energy passes the first 2 tests, but its economic viability raises questions. I'm a businessman. I'm always looking at the numbers. So I reviewed some levelized energy generation reports by the California Energy Commission, the University of Stanford, and MIT. Natural gas is by far the most cost-effective electricity generation method. The most efficient plants can produce electricity for just $10 per megawatt hour. Stanford and MIT concluded that even after accounting for the necessary retrofits, Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant will produce electricity at $54 per megawatt hour. Solar energy is comparable. It ranges about $40 to $60 per megawatt hour, but the lifespan is only 20 to 30 years, and it cannot produce energy at night. Offshore energy, like the project proposed off our coast here, is estimated to cost anywhere from $130 to $450 per megawatt hour. This is up to 8 times higher than nuclear and solar energy. If the cost of produced electricity increases exponentially, the cost of doing business will increase exponentially, and so can inflation. Some claim that any negative economic side effects of overly expensive energy projects will be offset by the jobs that will be created to construct them. However, if businesses are paying exponentially more for their electric bill, this will stifle growth and subsequently result in a net loss of jobs. I'd like to spend my money creating new jobs at my business rather than spending more money on my electricity bill. I do believe that striving for innovation and green solutions is important, but it needs to make sense for everyone. Implementation cannot be all or nothing. There needs to be an option that keeps Diablo Canyon and natural gas power plants operational as a backup. Diablo Canyon provides the cheapest and most reliable emissions-free energy in California. As my state has experienced an increasing number of blackouts, I credit our proximity to Diablo Canyon as one of the top reasons our community's businesses and residents have not found themselves in the dark as often as the average Californian. We need to find solutions that create both a happy planet and a happy economy. Thank you for considering my point of view and the well-being of small businesses as we come together to solve our society's most salient problems.
Thank you, Mr. Berg, and that concludes the testimony of the witnesses. I'm going to now bring it back for the panel, begin to ask questions, and I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. My first question goes to Mr. Stern, and I want to follow up on what Mr. Berg has said. Do you have, are you able to respond to the cost question that he's raised? He has raised a very significant and laid out his concerns. He said very supportive of the other issues, but the cost is the critical issue. Can you respond to that?
Happy to, Congressman. There's a study that I will submit to the record after this hearing from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which projects that floating offshore wind costs will decline to between $53 and $64 per megawatt hour by 2032, which is roughly the time when offshore wind will be available here in California. Those rates are very competitive with other sources of energy today. All of this has to do with economies of scale. As we build more offshore wind, the price will come down, and those projections follow what has already happened in Europe and is beginning to happen on the east coast of the U.S., which is somewhat further along on offshore wind. So this will be a cost-competitive energy source for California.
Thank you, and without objection, I'm going to enter into the record that report after this hearing right away.
Thank you, Congressman.
I'm now going to, again, ask Mr. Stern that, you've talked about some of the significant federal efforts to advance clean energy, invest in infrastructure that we've done over the past few years to both combat climate change, but also to build a stronger economy with those dual goals simultaneously. But my question to you is, what does the federal government have to do in the future now? What do you see as our role to further support offshore wind?
Thank you, Congressman. The things that I identified in my testimony, I'll just add and distill. It's moving ahead with the auction in the fall, planning for additional call areas because we need more of them to be able to reach these large goals, investing in transmission and port upgrades, which may be done through the infrastructure law that was just passed. The tax incentives that are part of the IRA will also be helpful. And we need, as a number of observers have pointed out today, we need to make the permitting process more efficient. There are multiple federal and state agencies that are involved, and laying out a roadmap which is part of the AB 525 legislation requirement, is a critical thing to make sure this gets done on time.
Thank you. Mr. Simone, and I don't have a question, but I really want to comment on your testimony, and I'm glad, because I'm going to ask another question to Mr. Ahn that's similar. I'm glad that you emphasized really the importance of project labor agreements. I think it was real clear in your testimony. why we need not to be undercut by cheap labor that really does not have the skills that are necessary, and that it's the real importance of project, and that how essential they are for building project labor agreements, a local workforce. And then you can bring in more trainees, more apprenticeships if we have project. And I just want to thank you for that testimony. But I want to go on to Mr. Ahn, following up that testimony. In your organization's comments to the proposed sale notice, you mentioned that the project labor agreements should include provisions for operators and contractors who are unable to meet the hiring requirements outlined in the lease. Can you explain why these off-ramp provisions are so important for an equitable workforce development?
Yes, happy to. Generally, when we talk about local hiring, it's to ensure that there's a local resilient economy at the end of the day. And we want to make sure that businesses are able to meet the demands that are, for instance, needed in installing and creating this kind of infrastructure. We want to make sure the workforce is being built up simultaneously. So in some ways, a chicken and egg problem, but it's essentially done through a robust workforce development system. And this is also the reason why in the BOEM PSN, there should be expanded bidding credits for things like local hiring provisions that also tie in ultimately to institutions, local academic institutions, or pre-apprenticeship programs that can ultimately create that labor supply. This is all in recognition that construction itself is backbreaking work. It requires, a long-term sustainable career pathway to succeed in that industry as a worker. And that's why, for instance, if you look at Labor's International Union, North America, LIUNA, they've built very robust pre-apprenticeship programs in this regard to make sure that their workers can succeed on the work site. So building those off-ramp provisions are very important.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield back and now recognize my colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Stauber, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Berg, thanks for participating today. As a small business owner, how much do you typically spend on energy costs, and how much does that affect your bottom line?
These past few months, I've been spending about $2,500 to $3,000 a month on energy costs. That may be small potatoes for some people, so to put that into perspective, I pay about $9,000 a month in rent, so I'm spending about a third of what I pay in rent on my small business on electricity, and it greatly affects my bottom line.
And then just because I don't have a lot of time, the high volatility in energy costs does affect your business.
Absolutely it does, yeah.
What kind of impact would soaring energy costs have on the distilling industry as a whole?
It would have dire consequences for the entire beverage industry in California, because we require an energy in every step of our process, from heating up our brews to cooling down our fermentations, and energy, like I said, is my third largest variable cost.
And would you transfer that cost to the consumer?
Absolutely, I would have to.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stern, thank you very much for your comments. As I talked earlier, the critical minerals in northeastern Minnesota, the biggest copper nickel find in North America, that this administration has pulled the leases on and won't let us mine these minerals. Can offshore wind California commit to domestically mined, processed, and manufactured wind turbines with American jobs instead of foreign sources that actually emit more greenhouse gases in the life cycle and use child slave labor in some of the supply chains? Can you commit to that?
Thank you, Congressman. That's not an area of my expertise at this time, but I am happy to confer with you separately and your staff to gain additional information on the mineral opportunities.
Let me ask it another way.
Sure.
Take yourself out of the realm of being the CEO of Offshore Wind California. As an individual living in California, knowing what we have in Minnesota, would you commit to it? If it was just your decision, would you commit to domestically sourced critical minerals mined by project labor agreements, union members in northeastern Minnesota?
In principle, that sounds like a good idea.
It shouldn't be that hard. It should not be that hard to answer that. We can bring these jobs back. The IBEW, Mr. Simonin, his workers have the project labor agreement, and this administration pulled the lease, won't allow us to mine.
His union members are going to build these plants in a project labor agreement. Mr. Simonin, I really appreciate you bringing up the project labor agreements, because as a pro-labor Republican, that registered apprenticeship that you bring, you need those project labor agreements to bring those apprentices in to show them the trade and get them, because we need more blue-collar union workers to rebuild this country. And so the frustrating thing that I see here is we want to transition, but you won't use our minerals. We had a supervisor in the prior panel talk about the getting rid of these windmills at the end of their life cycles and these batteries. We don't have the answer right now. Those are questions we still need to answer, but it's frustrating for me, and I want the audience to know, it's very frustrating for me to know that you don't support my union workforce in northeastern Minnesota that can mine these critical minerals. And we've been doing it for years, over 135 years. The cleanest water in the state of Minnesota is in the heart of mining country. You take away the Iron Range in northeastern Minnesota, you have no steel industry in this country, which is a strategic national security interest, which, by the way, is involved in these windmills, in these wind farms, and the solar panels. COVID has shown us we must reshore so many of these activities, including critical minerals and mining, and the solar panels manufactured and made in this country by union labor. Let's come together, California. I need you to understand what northern Minnesota can bring to this conversation. And Mr. Stern, I do appreciate you answering that, but really, it's the offshore wind California. Your whole organization should commit to American labor, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Stauber. I now call upon Mr. Carbajal for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Simonin, how could the project labor agreement stipulations be improved for the final sale notice?
Well, it could be more than a recommendation, a requirement. It would be important to us. And as detailed in the IBEW International Office's comments on BOEM's California Offshore Wind PSN, which are referenced in my written statement, the PLA stipulation could be improved by revising the proposed language, which currently states the leasees would be required to make every reasonable effort to enter into a PLA. As explained in those comments, this language can be improved by simply making this stipulation a requirement to enter into a PLA.
Thank you. Does San Luis Obispo County have enough electrical workers for the current workload? And what do you see as a strong need for workforce training?
The short answer is yes, and as I explained in my testimony, union construction members regularly travel for work, often great distances. So even in San Luis Obispo County itself, if it did not have a sufficient number of available electricians to work on the given project, we do what we do, and as always, we have done work with other IBEW brothers and sisters in the surrounding areas to make sure that there are plenty of electricians to meet the current and future workload.
Thank you, Mr. Simonin. I too acknowledge that when we talk about the area, it's not just San Luis, it's the region. And I know REACH has done a lot of work in identifying a region which stems into Santa Barbara County as well. So I appreciate you talking about the broad region that it is when it comes to workers. Mr. Ahn, in your comments to BOEM on the PSN, you mentioned support for the addition of a, quote, regional tribal capacity fund, lease stipulation, and 10% bidding credit, unquote, end quote, to provide additional funding for tribal communities to provide input on offshore wind planning. Can you tell us why this regional tribal capacity fund is needed and how it would strengthen the offshore wind planning process?
I think earlier in the witness panel, you also heard from Violet Sage Walker, who very bluntly answered the question that essentially it's volunteer labor that the Northern Chumash Tribal Council is currently doing to even engage on something like offshore wind. So that kind of capacity fund could resource tribes such as the Northern Chumash Tribal Council to further engage, do the environmental monitoring, and the overall processes that are needed to really drive infrastructure at the end of the day around offshore wind. More generally, it's the idea that there should be public investment in infrastructure, whether it's roads, Wi-Fi, clean ports, when we're talking about expanding, essentially development around offshore wind to support this industry. And again, making sure that the tribes are strong in the surrounding regions through these things, like a capacity fund, is really important.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And now our final questions come from Ms. Conway. 5 minutes.
I'm the closer, Mr. Chair? Am I the closer?
You are the closer. You've kind of passed all the tests up until now.
I wanted to be the
committee
closer.
hearing, field hearing, and now we're asking you to close.
And I will do that within the 4 minutes and 52 seconds I have left. Thank you. And I appreciate all the testimony from all of you. It's heartfelt, as all of the testimony was today, and that's appreciated by someone like me. Mr. Stern, I had a quick question. Other than, and it may have been Mr. On that mentioned it, but I'm assuming that the wind industry, there's tax incentives involved in the cost for, building this. Certainly the infrastructure is part of it, and then the windmills themselves. Is there any other government money, i.e. that's taxpayers, because the taxpayers are the government in the bottom line? Do the taxpayers have an investment in this, or is this all this will be done by the industry itself?
The bulk of the investment will be from industry. The tax credits will make it more economic. There are other investments that the state may be making in terms of transmission, federal and state investments as port upgrades, which I spoke about. But this is largely paid for by capital investments from the industry, and then ratepayers, of course, pay the electricity prices, which, as I said, offshore wind will be a competitive source of clean energy for California.
And so that brought up another question, because you did mention that, the cost eventually, but to start with, will cost?
By the Congresswoman, by the time the projects will be built here in California, we expect to be well down the cost curve, and the price numbers that the Federal National Renewable Energy Laboratory has identified, that's what we expect the range of prices to be, which is very economic and competitive with other energy sources today.
Okay, I appreciate that. And speaking of cost, Mr. Simonin, I think you mentioned that your workers have to commute and have to drive. I mean, the price of gas is crazy right now. That has got to impact your workers if they have to travel and if they have to do you see a resolution to any of that? I mean, the price is double what it was at one time, especially here in California.
I think that might be a little out of my lane as far as
out of your lane.
Cost.
That was good.
Yeah,
that was good.
I don't know if that was intended or not. But
it was good.
Yeah, no, but we do definitely appreciate that. There's a lot of cost of living things that are coming into play. We have workforce housing issues in the area. It's a beautiful area. It is a destination, and it does make challenges for the workers. So we just do the best we can when we negotiate our contracts and try to establish the living wage.
I appreciate that. I grew up in a labor union household. My father was a proud member of the Communication Workers of America. And so the conversation was different in those days about what the role of labor unions, but still, I learned a lot growing up, and I can actually remember most of it, which is good for me. Mr. Berg, I had something I wanted to ask you. And I wrote it down. Let's find it here, Connie. Hurry up! You're wasting time. So the cost of, I am just looking for ways to not lose our small businesses. I don't know, energy being such a huge cost to small business. I see people going out left and right. If we could reduce that energy cost, is that one of the greatest impacts to your business? I know there's others, but lowering the cost of energy, is that going to make a big difference to help small businesses stay in business? Or are there other outside things that are preying on small businesses at this point?
Well, everything's trying to prey on small businesses at this point. But as far as energy, I'm paying 4 times more for my natural gas right now than I was 2 years ago, which is crazy. Everything is really expensive. I'm looking at the numbers I'm paying for energy, and not only is it stifling my business, but it's preventing me from hiring more employees. And for the amount that I'm paying in energy, that would be enough for me to hire a part-time employee right now and grow my business's sales.
And there's probably people that need your business when,
yes.
when they pay their energy bill.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Mr. On, real quick, if I have any time left, you mentioned about the tribes, and we had the testimony this morning. I actually contacted my friends at the Chumash tribe. I don't know that those two are connected in any way, but are we doing sufficient? I mean, you mentioned benefit agreements, I think, with tribes. Is that all tribes or just the one in particular?
I think originally when the capacity fund was also mentioned by Representative Carbajal, I think the other region to consider is in the North Coast as well, where there's probably anywhere between half a dozen to maybe even as many as 12 tribes that will have interest in offshore wind. And so in other words, there are a lot of tribes that can be potentially in the mix. And with the Chumash, as I understand, there's several different Chumash tribes too that may have interest in offshore wind. But that said, part of it is also recognizing, of course, Brightline as an environmental justice nonprofit, we can't speak for the tribes. It's more about making sure they get what they need to engage appropriately. And I think, again, to state and federal government agencies' credit, they've been doing the appropriate outreach and making sure at least there's outreach occurring, but whether each individual tribal entity has the time, the staff, the resources essentially to respond to a governmental request for engagement is another question entirely.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your patience with me.
Thank you for closing. You have a new role as our closer. And I want to thank all the witnesses and for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. This is going to conclude our final panel. Again, I'm going to say before you leave, there may be additional questions for you. We ask that you respond in writing to them. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for you to respond to those questions. And before we stand adjourned again, I want to thank Mayor John Heading and the City Council of Morro Bay for allowing us to use this wonderful community facility. I want to thank all those that attended this hearing. I hope that you got a lot out of the subcommittee. We had, I think, a very full subcommittee hearing with various points of view that we're going to take back to Washington. And I want to thank the panelists, the witnesses, all of the witnesses, but I especially want to thank all of our staff who worked so hard in putting this together. This was a wonderful contribution. Yes, and just before we conclude, the ranking member Stauber would like to say something.
Chairman Lowenthal, Representative Carbajal, thanks for the invite to your beautiful district. I've certainly enjoyed myself, and Chairman, as I opened up, I really, really appreciate you. We have become friends. We don't agree on everything, but your leadership has propelled our subcommittee forward, and I can't thank you enough. You're going to be missed, and we have still a couple months to work.
Yes.
But we're gonna get it done. And before I conclude, I would like to also thank all the witnesses. And in my past life, I was a police officer for 23 years in the city of Duluth, Minnesota. And to the chief of police back there, thank you for your service, and stay safe, my friend. And I yield back.
Thank you. And with that, if there's no further business, without objections, this subcommittee stands adjourned.